Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little wild, something a little cold, a little damp, and definitely life-threatening. You're going to step aboard a Viking longship, headed out from the icy fjords of Scandinavia and into the unrelenting wilds of the North Atlantic. No fire, no heater, no warm tea, just wool, wind, salted meat, and a whole lot of stubbornness. And yes, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Honestly, even the Vikings barely did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now, and what city are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice isn't the cold, it's the calm. Tar, wet wood, damp wool and fish, all of it laced with the metallic tang of salt in the air. The longship before you is a marvel, but not the romantic kind you've seen in movies. It's narrow, low to the water, and absolutely soaked. The planks are darkened from repeated sea spray and endless scrubbing with brine-soaked rags. Everything feels wet, even before you board. You take a breath, then step up onto the deck. There's no roaring hearth, no glowing brazier. Fire on a longship? Not unless you want to go up like an oily pine torch in the middle of the ocean. The wood's too dry in places, too soaked in others. One wrong spark and it's driftwood, and not the kind you hope to find on a beach. So instead, the warmth comes from layers of clothing and the constant work of staying alive. You're surrounded by men and a few tough-as-nails women, all wrapped in heavy cloaks made from layered wool and lined with fur. Their breath steams in the air, mingling in low clouds above the deck. Everyone is moving, coiling rope, checking the sail, stowing salted meat wrapped in sealskin, lashing down oars. There's no standing around unless you want to freeze in place like some kind of idiot statue. You follow their lead. The captain, or what passes for one, is a tall guy named Eric with a beard that could catch small birds. He gives you a look, then nods toward the stern. "We leave on the tie," he growls, which might sound dramatic, but is actually just a practical fact. With no modern instruments, the Vikings had to rely on timing, tides, winds, and star paths. Everything had to be ready before the sea decided it was ready for you. And this isn't just a pleasure cruise. These voyages were serious. You're heading west, across an ocean so violent and cold it regularly eats ships and spits out bits of them on icy beaches months later. The goal? Maybe it's trade. Maybe it's new land. Maybe it's exile. Honestly, half the crew doesn't seem to care. They're used to this kind of madness. The ship launches with a splash and a creak as sliding out of the fjord like a thick black needle cutting through the mirror of the sea. Oars rise and fall, splashing rhythmically, while the sail unfurls with a loud snapping gust. Wind takes it almost instantly, and just like that, you're not a person anymore. You're cargo, muscle and ballast on a floating plank coffin with no fire and no guarantees. A few hours in, the cold finally hits. It's a creeping kind of freeze, sneaky and slow. Your boots are soaked, even though they're stuffed with wool and wrapped with hide. Your hands are already stinging, and the damp air feels like it's trying to crawl into your bones. But everyone else seems fine, annoyed, grumbling, hungry maybe, but not frozen. One old guy is even chewing on dried fish like it's a snack. His beard is literally collecting icicles, and he doesn't blink. You try to find shelter behind the low railing, but there's no escape from the wind. It cuts through even the best clothes. Vikings didn't use insulation or modern waterproofs. They used layers. Wool over linen, fur over wool, sealskin cloaks for wind. If one layer gets wet, you don't strip it, you add more. The idea isn't to be dry, it's to be less wet than dead. And there's no fire to dry your clothes, no stove to heat your hands. If you're lucky, there's a pouch of mead or ale, slightly warm from body heat, passed around in silence. If you're really lucky, someone's got a sour cheese or pickled fish to share, but more often you just pull your cloak tighter and keep rowing. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Viking longships weren't made for comfort. They were made for function. The wide, shallow hulls helped them ride over waves rather than crash through them, but it also meant no shelter, just an open boat 16 to 20 metres long with the whole North Atlantic waiting to slap you upside the head. And yet, here's your historical fact for the night. Vikings made it. Regularly. They crossed from Scandinavia to Iceland, then Greenland, and eventually even reached the edges of North America, hundreds of years before Columbus ever got lost near a beach. They did it using only their shipcraft, sense of the skies, and sheer pig-headed resolve. Quirky fact, the Vikings believed in sea monsters, specifically the Hafgufa, a creature so massive it looked like an island until it opened its jaws and swallowed ships whole. So not only were they cold and hungry, they were also watching the waves for what might be camouflaged carnivorous continents. Which is comforting, right? But not everything about these trips is known. Here's the big scholarly debate still rattling around academic circles. Did the Vikings really make these long journeys without any kind of onboard heating, like enclosed braziers or covered hearths? Some evidence suggests they might have brought stones heated before departure, or used fire in extremely controlled settings, especially near land, but others argue fire on a wooden ship was simply too risky. Either way, fire wasn't something they relied on out at sea. Heat came from bodies, food and movement, or not at all. You shift again, feeling the wooden planks cold against your legs. The sea around you stretches grey and endless, speckled with slushy flows of ice and distant birds gliding low over the waves. The wind's picked up, and the sail groans under the pressure. Someone curses, someone else starts a low chant, half song, half rhythm, to keep spirits from slipping. And you, freezing, wet, and very much regretting this whole adventure, settle into the grim reality. This is just the beginning. You haven't even hit open sea yet. You wake up with your cheek pressed against damp wood, fresh ache running down your side from sleeping in a position that could only be described as human origami. There's no mattress, no blanket, just a huddle of limbs, furs, and the ever-present smell of wool that's never been properly dried. At some point in the night, someone rolled onto your foot and didn't move. At another, you heard something squeal. Might have been the ship's hull, or maybe someone's dream turning into a nightmare. When you sit up, you realise your cloak is stiff with salt. The ocean spray froze it during the night, turning it into a kind of personal armour, not a helpful kind, just the crunchy, cold kind. You're still nowhere near North America. You're not even past Iceland yet, and the weather's doing its best impression of the end times. There's no fire. Not on deck, not below, not anywhere. It's not like you're refusing to use it out of some eco-conscious Viking minimalism. You just can't. Fire on a boat is a liability, not a luxury. One ember in the wrong place and you're choosing between drowning in ice water or cooking alive on the waves. So instead, you warm yourself the Viking way. Layers. You're wearing wool, lots of it, and not the soft, cosy merino kind. This stuff itches like it holds a grudge. But it works. Wool keeps you warm even when it's wet, and right now, that's the only reason you're not a popsicle. Underneath you've got a tunic, linen if you're lucky, and under that maybe another layer of scratchy wool. Then pants, leg wrappings called winnegers, leather boots stuffed with moss or fleece, and everything tied tight to keep the wind out. Over it all, a cloak. Not decorative, functional, thick, heavy, and lined with whatever fur someone didn't mind giving up. Across the deck you see a man with a helmet, not the horned kind by the way, that's a myth, but a simple iron cap with a leather strap. His cloak is pinned with a brooch shaped like Thor's hammer. He's wrapping his hands in strips of cloth, adding a second layer over his gloves. You're watching a masterclass in cold weather survival without the benefit of fire, hot chocolate, or common sense. Here's your historical fact for this section. Vikings weren't just about raids and sword swinging. They were also expert textile workers. In fact, textile production was one of the most important domestic industries in Viking society. Women were especially skilled at spinning wool, weaving it into dense, weather-resistant cloth, and treating it with oils or fats to improve water resistance. A single cloak could take weeks to produce, but once it was finished, it could mean the difference between life and death in the North Atlantic. You try moving around to get the blood flowing. That's another trick. Movement equals warmth. The moment you stop rowing, bailing, or chanting, the cold creeps in. That's why no one just sits around doing nothing on a Viking voyage. Everyone's in motion, even if it's just shivering creatively. Now, your quirky fact. Some Viking garments were so finely made that they've survived over 1,000 years in burial mounds. In one case, a tunic found in Norway, dated to the 9th century, was woven so tightly that it could still repel water centuries later. You can imagine some Viking ghost furiously annoyed that their shirt has been in better condition than your modern hoodie after one laundry cycle. And then there's the ongoing scholarly debate. For years, researchers have argued over whether the Vikings used lanolin, natural sheep oil, as a waterproofing treatment for wool clothing. Some evidence suggests they didn't wash all the lanolin out of the wool, giving it a sort of built-in water resistance. Others argue that they likely used additional treatments, like rubbing cloaks with animal fat or beeswax to further repel water. There's no consensus, but either way, what they wore worked, because you're not frozen to death yet. Wind cuts across the deck again, making your cloak flap and snap like a sail trying to abandon a ship. Eric barks something at a younger crew member, who's dragging a fur-wrapped bundle along the deck. More clothes, or maybe someone who passed out and needs reviving. No fire means no drying station. If your clothes get wet, you wear them until they dry from your own body heat, or you shiver them dry out of spite. And there's no heated cabin to duck into. At best, you can crawl under a makeshift tarp strung between two oar benches, hide under some furs, and hope no one kicks snow onto you, which they probably will. Accidents happen, or maybe they're not accidents. Tempers run short out here. It's hard not to feel like the cold is winning. Your fingers are numb, your nose has been dripping since yesterday, and your lips are starting to split. But the people around you, they're laughing. Not loudly, just soft chuckles between curses and stories about previous voyages. One man is miming how a goat stole his boot. Another is brushing ice off his beard like it's dandruff. They've done this before. Some of them were born into it. There's a kind of weird comfort in that. They don't expect warmth. They don't wait for it. They endure. And endurance, out here, is everything. You dig into a small pouch tucked beneath your tunic and find a lump of wool, soaked in animal fat, not food, hand warmer. You rub it between your palms, the slick texture unpleasant but the faint heat welcome. It smells like everything else, salt, wool and meat. But it works. Someone next to you offers a piece of felted cloth wrapped around hot stones. They'd been warmed earlier, stored in the thickest part of the ship's supplies, nestled among furs to keep their heat. It's barely warm now. But against your skin it's like touching sunlight. You press it to your neck, then your wrists, trying to wake up whatever circulation hasn't given up on you. The sky overhead is iron grey, pressed low and heavy. Snow spits from the clouds in lazy, sideways flurries. You see seabirds again, signs of land, or just tricksters leading you nowhere? Hard to say, but every small hint matters. You're watching the horizon for more than just ice, and you're watching for hope. And under all of this, you're starting to understand something. The Vikings didn't conquer the cold, they didn't beat it with fire or shelter or insulation. They accepted it, wrapped themselves in it, worked with it, around it, through it. Their clothes didn't keep them toasty, they kept them functional. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival. Which means you have to stop thinking like a tourist on an uncomfortable camping trip. You're not here for luxury, you're here to not die. And so far, you're not dead, which, as Viking standards go, is a solid win. Your stomach growls loudly. It's not just a polite nudge anymore, it's a full-blown protest. You'd swear your ribs are gnawing on each other in there. But the worst part? The scent. Not the good kind. There's no fresh-baked anything wafting through the air. No sizzling fat or spiced broth warming up over a flame. Instead, you're surrounded by the smells of dried fish, old sweat, wet wool, and a distant whiff of something that might once have been cheese but now just smells like regret. Welcome to mealtime on a fireless Viking voyage. It's not gourmet, but it keeps you alive. Barely. The crew starts pulling out their food, leather pouches, horn containers, wrapped bundles of oiled cloth. There's no line, no meal service, and certainly no seating arrangement. You eat when you can, where you can, and if you wait too long, your food might literally freeze solid. You open your ration pack and stare at it. A chunk of dried fish, a slice of hard, unleavened bread that could double as a weapon, and a strange white mass that might be lard, or possibly candle wax. Either way, you're expected to eat it, and you do because your body doesn't care what it tastes like. It just wants fat, salt, and anything chewable. Here's your historical fact. The Viking diet on voyages like this was tailored for endurance. They prioritised calorie-dense, long-lasting foods that didn't spoil easily. Dried fish, usually cod or herring, was a staple. It was salted and air-dried until it resembled fish jerky, then packed into watertight containers. Alongside that, they carried hardtack-style bread called flatbread, which was so dry it could outlast your will to live. And then there was the fat, rendered animal fat, often pork or seal, sometimes mixed with herbs or blood to form a primitive kind of high-calorie paste. You take a bite of the dried fish. It's chewy, salty and not entirely lifeless. There's something satisfying about it, in a primal way, like your body recognises it as fuel, even if your taste buds stage a walkout. The bread is worse. You try to break off a piece and nearly bend your thumbnail back. Eventually, you soften it with your own spit and chew like you're grinding rocks. The lard, though, it goes down surprisingly easy. It's smooth, rich, and leaves a coating on your tongue that lingers long after the taste is gone. And here's where things get weird. You kind of crave it. Your body, freezing and starving for heat, latches onto that fat like it's the warm embrace of a long-lost lover. No one's cooking anything. There's no fire to cook over. No grill, no pot, no stew bubbling in a kettle. Everything here is raw, fermented, or pre-dried. The idea of hot food is laughable. The Vikings didn't waste time pining for it. They knew what worked, and then they stuck with it. Across the deck, a man named Sigtrig is gnawing on something that looks like meat, but darker. You ask him what it is, and he shrugs. Horse, maybe, or seal. He offers you a bite, and against your better judgment, you accept. It's tangy, salty, and has the texture of leather that's been soaked in vinegar. Somehow, it's not awful. Sigtrig grins. Fermented. Buried it for months before we left. Keeps better. Which brings us to your quirky fact. Vikings often fermented meat and fish, not just to preserve it, but to make it more digestible during long voyages. One famous or infamous example is harkarl, a traditional Icelandic dish, made by fermenting Greenland shark meat and hanging it to dry for several months. It reeks of ammonia and sadness, but was considered a delicacy, and yes, edible without fear. While it's unclear if the original Viking explorers packed harkarl specifically, the idea of fermentation as survival was very much part of their culinary playbook. You lean back against the railing, chewing slowly, letting your body take what it can from this strange, cold feast. Your hands are shaking, but after eating, the cold feels just a little less sharp. That's the magic of fat. The human body burns it slow and hot, like a candle in the dark. And the Vikings, they were essentially running on blubber-based batteries. Now here's where scholars like to squabble. Did the Vikings actually eat raw meat and fat during their voyages? Or did they have some form of heat, like stone warming pans or insulated iron kettles they could use for minimal cooking? There's no definitive answer. Some sagas hint at hot meals, but that could reflect land-based life, not sea voyages. Most evidence suggests that on long journeys, especially those across the North Atlantic, hot meals were rare to non-existent. Fire was too dangerous, and the ingredients were built to survive without it. A small group huddles together midship, not for warmth, but for mealtime chatter. They trade chunks of food, bartering like medieval kids at a Viking school lunch. One man offers a hunk of cheese that smells like despair in exchange for a pouch of nuts. Someone else passes around pickled eggs, which have gone slightly blue. You don't ask why. There's laughter, surprisingly. Jokes about someone's cooking, ironic since no one's cooking anything. They rib each other about who packed the worst rations. One unlucky soul pulls out a slab of liver that's clearly gone rogue. Everyone groans, then laughs again. This, oddly, is what passes for joy on the cold sea. Not warmth, but the shared experience of enduring the same miserable menu. You finish your meal by licking your fingers clean. Every bit of fat counts. Then you wrap the leftovers in oiled cloth and tuck them back into your pouch. There's no waste here. Food is survival, not flavour. If you don't eat enough fat, your body starts cannibalising itself. And when you're this cold, the line between hunger and hypothermia gets thin fast. By now the wind has picked up. Snowflakes dance across the deck, sticking to your cloak like ash. The sky's still overcast and the sea still endless. But with a full belly, even a Viking definition full, you feel steadier, more ready. That's the thing about these voyages. It's not about conquering nature, it's about outlasting it. You learn to eat what the sea allows, what your ancestors packed, and what your stomach doesn't immediately reject. You learn that a cold, raw lump of seal fat might just be the thing that keeps you alive until morning. And you learn too that the absence of fire doesn't mean the absence of life. The Vikings didn't need flames to stay warm. They used bodies, food, furs, and stubbornness. Fire was a luxury, fat was the plan. And right now, you're starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, that plan is working. You're getting used to the cold now, not in the way that it stops hurting, oh no, it still hurts, but in the way that your brain just files it under normal. Your nose is constantly numb, your fingers tingle more than they feel, and your breath fog's so thick you can't tell if it's the sea mist or your own lungs giving up, but your stomach's full-ish, and that counts for a lot out here. This morning's meal comes from a waxed pouch tucked deep into the captain's personal stash. When he opens it, the smell hits you like a slap. It's sour, sharp, and somehow both rotting and preserved. A few of the crew lean in, nodding with approval. Eric pulls out a slab of fermented fish and tears into it like it's a feast. Then he offers it around. You hesitate. Of course you do. It smells like a dead thing buried in vinegar and then forgotten in someone's attic. But you're not exactly in a position to be picky. You take a bite. The texture is mushy, the taste acidic, and the aftertaste sticks like a bad decision. But weirdly, you keep chewing. Your body's not here for taste. It's here for nutrients, salt, and fat. 3 things this horror in a pouch has in spades. Welcome to the secret of Viking endurance cuisine, fermentation. It might not look like much, but it's why you're not starving, even without a fire in sight. Here's your historical fact for the night. The Vikings were masters of fermentation. Long before refrigerators or stoves, they learned how to manipulate time, temperature, and bacteria to preserve food. Fish, especially herring and cod, was often buried in the ground, packed in seaweed or birch bark, and left to sour for months. Meat could be soaked in whey or brine, or just left in cool, damp pits to develop that very specific Viking funk. And while you might recoil, your body says thank you. Some of the fermented dishes were almost like Viking charcuterie. In fact, archaeological digs at Norse settlements in Greenland and Iceland have revealed storage pits containing preserved animal fats, sour milk curds, and partially decomposed meats, all carefully wrapped, layered, and protected against the elements. These weren't leftovers, these were lifesavers. Today, though, you're chewing something called surströmming, or something very much like it, fermented Baltic herring that's still made in parts of Scandinavia today. Modern versions come in tins that sometimes explode from the pressure. The Viking version, no tin, just a gut feeling, literally. And here's a quirky fact. When fermentation was done right, the food could last you all years. Some Norse families passed down fermented stores from generation to generation, like sourdough starters, but way smellier. There's even a saga where a character gets into a fight over the family curds, which is probably not the legacy you want carved on your gravestone. But hey, people have died over less. The debate among scholars? It's about how widespread these fermentation methods actually were during transatlantic voyages. Some argue that fermented food was used only during times of scarcity, like bad winters or poor hunting seasons. Others believe it was the default on long sea trips where fire wasn't possible and spoilage was deadly. The evidence leans toward the latter, especially when you consider that salted and smoked food requires constant fuel, something you don't have when sailing across a frozen ocean with no trees in sight. You're learning quickly that survival at sea wasn't about luxury, it was about strategy. Every meal, every bite was a calculation. Could it survive without a flame? Would it stay edible through snow and salt spray? Would it keep your joints from locking up in the cold? If yes, it was food. Period. Nearby, one of the younger crew members offers you a bite of skyer, a thick, sour dairy product that's somewhere between yogurt and cheese. It's been packed in a horn jar, sealed with beeswax. Cold, dense, just sucks tangy. You eat it gratefully. It's got protein, it's easy on the stomach, and somehow it still tastes fresh. That's the beauty of fermentation. It doesn't spoil in the cold, it thrives. You may not have fire, but you've got chemistry on your side. After the meal, cleanup is non-existent. You wipe your hands on your cloak, no one's judging, and tuck your pouch away. The wind has picked up again, this time with a sharper bite. Snow has started falling, soft and dry, building up in the folds of cloaks and the grooves in the deck. You shake it off your shoulders and start moving. Always moving. Because sitting still is an invitation for the cold to settle into your bones. As you look around, you realise there's a strange sort of rhythm to this life. You eat, you row, you shiver, you sleep, you chew on something sour, then haul ropes through slush. There's a song for rowing, a chant for pulling sails, and jokes between bites of decomposed fish. It's miserable, yes, but it works. Every part of the Viking voyage is designed around efficiency and survival. Comfort never even made it on the packing list, and the thing is, you're not dead. Not yet. You're cold, sure, hungry, always, but you've eaten today, and your body, wrapped in wool crusted with salt and stinking like a cheese cellar, has fuel to burn. You've got enough fat to keep the furnace going even without flame. Later that night you're lying on the deck again, curled up under your cloak. Snowflakes settle gently across your face. Your beard, if you've grown one by now, is stiff with the frost. Somewhere nearby, a man is softly singing, his voice low and hoarse. Another is whispering a prayer to Thor. You don't know the words, but the cadence is enough to lull you into a kind of dazed rest. No fire, no firelight, just the stars, when the clouds part, and the creak of the mast above. The cold presses in like a second skin, but your belly is full of sour food and stubborn pride. You close your eyes, you'll wake up shivering, you'll wake up hungry, but you'll wake up. And that, out here on the freezing sea, is about as close to victory as it gets. The sail groans overhead, pulled taut by the sharp slap of wind rolling off the open sea. You're awake before dawn, though to be honest, it's hard to tell the difference out here. The sky hasn't so much lightened as it has softened, from black to bruised grey. It smells like salt and iron and something colder than snow, like the kind of cold that doesn't fall but settles in your bones and waits. You drag yourself upright, joints stiff from sleeping on wet wood. There's a fine layer of frost on the deck, and it crunches underfoot as you walk. The cloak you slept in has frozen in a few places, creasing like leather. Everything about this voyage is an assault on your comfort, and yet the ship itself keeps moving forward, cutting through the waves like it was born to do nothing else. And honestly, it kind of was. This is no ordinary boat. It's a Viking longship, and not the Hollywood version. No polished gold trim or pristine white sails. This one is rough, worn, salt-stained and battle-tested. The sides are low, close to the water, and every swell sends spray across the deck. There's no shelter, no below-deck hammocks, just planks, ropes, and the ever-present scream of wind through the rigging. But the way this thing handles the waves, it's unreal. Here's your historical fact for the day. Viking longships were marvels of engineering. They were clinker-built, meaning the planks overlapped like scales, making the hull flexible but strong. This allowed the ship to flex with the sea instead of breaking against it. The keel, the spine of the ship, was designed to track straight, and the shallow draft meant it could sail in open ocean and navigate rivers and coastlines. These ships weren't just tools, they were lifelines. You move to the side of the ship and grip the railing, cold as iron, and look out at the sail. It's made of wool, heavy and coarse, and stained a deep reddish brown. But there's more to it than that. The wool's been soaked in animal fat and urine. Yeah, heard that right. And then pounded till it's thick and to water resistant. Not exactly high fashion, but it keeps the wind from ripping the sail to shreds. And the ropes? They're not just lying around casually. Every knot, every coil, every frayed edge has been adjusted and readjusted over and over. The Vikings didn't have synthetic fibres or steel cables. They used hemp, flax, and sometimes strips of hide, all woven by hand and sealed with resin. You touch one, and it's as hard as your forearm. The quirky fact. Some Viking sails were made from horsehair. Not entirely, usually blended with wool, but horsehair added extra stiffness and durability. There are accounts of entire warbands shearing horses for this purpose, which, while effective, probably didn't do much for the horse's feelings. Still, a horsehair and wool sail could withstand brutal sea winds better than plain wool alone. Someone barks a command. It's time to adjust the rigging. The wind has shifted, and the ship needs to lean into it like a drunk uncle trying to walk home in a storm. You leap to the nearest line and haul. It takes all your strength, and your hands burn from the cold, but the sail creaks and turns. The longship responds like it's alive, angling into the waves with just the right amount of give. The mast groans, but it holds. Now comes the part the crew always braces for. Ice on the rigging. Spray hits the sail and freezes mid-air, slowly building a crunchy crystal crust that adds weight and drag. The crew jumps into action with sticks, boots, even knives, knocking the ice loose before it becomes a problem. You join in, chipping frost off a support beam. Every crack of the ice feels like progress, like beating the cold one shard at a time. And here's the scholarly debate still rattling around among nautical historians. How exactly did Viking sails handle the freeze? There's evidence that the sails were designed to shed water, but some argue they also carried spare sails in case of freezing. Others believe the crew simply managed the ice manually, like you are now, with brute strength and a lot of cursing. There's no definitive answer, just educated guesses and salty reenactors who have tried sailing replicas in modern Nordic weather and lived to complain about it. You slip a little as the deck tilts. The longship doesn't just glide forward, it moves, It rides each wave like it's dancing. You can feel it in your knees and spine, the way it rises and falls in a kind of hypnotic rhythm. You're not just riding in the ship, you're part of it now, a moving piece of timber and breath and muscle in a very damp, very chilly organism. And somehow this wooden beast holds together. In these waters, freezing, choppy, unpredictable, the ship flexes, groans and adjusts with every slap of wave. The men trust it. They trust it more than they trust the weather, the gods, or probably even each other. You lean into the wind again, nananten, watching the horizon. The clouds are shifting, making way for a sliver of pale, watery sunlight that hits the sail just right. For a moment the reddish cloth glows, and you can see the weave of fibres, each one knotted, stretched and beaten into obedience. You think about how much time must have gone into making this thing. How many hands carded the wool, spun the yarn, dyed it with bark or blood or whatever else was lying around. How many women worked in smoky longhouses, weaving by firelight, turning wool into war machines. It's not just fabric, it's legacy. There's a creak behind you. Eric's standing by the tiller, steering with the kind of calm that only comes from doing this since childhood. He spits over the side, then looks up at the sail. "She'll hold," he mutters. Not to anyone in particular, maybe not even to you, just a quiet faith in the thing carrying him over death's backyard. The rest of the day is a mix of frozen fog and monotonous movement. The ship creaks, the sail flaps, the sea growls. But it all holds together, because the ship is built for this. It was never designed for pleasure, or even comfort. It was made to survive this exact nightmare. A fireless, freezing voyage across a bitter ocean with nothing but the wind at your back and the salt on your lips. By nightfall, the wind calms a little. Not much, but enough to let you breathe without squinting into your own eyelids. You huddle again under your cloak, listening to the sail above you. Stiff, flapping, alive. And for all the misery around you, you can't help but respect the ship. This strange groaning craft with its sails of hair and hope. It's not warm, it's not kind, but it floats, it moves forward. And for now, that's all it needs to do. The sky has turned pale again, smeared with low clouds that hang just above the water, like a ceiling that someone forgot to finish painting. You're starting to lose track of time, not just the hours, but the days. Out here, the sun doesn't rise so much as it hints at being nearby, then gives up. Still, the crew stirs like clockwork, as if their bodies are tethered to some internal compass that ignores the grey. Today you're learning how to navigate without a compass. Because remember, there's no fire, no metal instruments, no glowing GPS dot blinking you toward Newfoundland. You've got eyes, stars, birds, wind, and sheer blistering faith. And somehow for centuries that was enough. Eric calls the crew to order just after the morning meal, another elegant feast of salted meat and sour cheese you had to chew with determination rather than teeth. You wipe your fingers on your cloak and climb toward the stern, where he's scanning the horizon, one hand gripping the tiller, the other resting on the ship's carved dragonhead like it's a favourite pet. "Wind shifting," he says, squinting at the clouds. "Storm last night broke the pattern." You nod like you know what that means. You don't. But he starts pointing. That layer there. He gestures to a dark streak in the sky. High altitude cirrus from the southwest means warm wind, probably wet. And that, he points lower toward fast-moving cumulus clouds skimming the ocean. East wind driving that, so we adjust. You try to keep up. The Vikings weren't guessing when they crossed the ocean. They were reading it. Reading the clouds, the colour of the water, the shape of the waves. They knew which seabirds flew far from land and which never strayed more than a day's sail from shore. They tracked whales, driftwood, even how seaweed clung to their hulls. Nature was their map. Here's your historical fact. Viking navigators used a combination of the environmental clues to stay on course. They observed the angle of the sun using something like a primitive sundial or sun compass, and in low light they possibly used a legendary tool called a sunstone, a crystal, likely Iceland's spar, that could polarize sunlight even through cloud cover. No magnetic compass, no sextant, just rocks, eyes and beastan, and brains wired for survival. A few crew members gather behind you, murmuring about the birds. A small flock of black and white puffins skims the surface of the sea, heading west. Eric smiles faintly. They don't like to sleep on water. If they're going that way, there's land not too far. Another Viking trick. Watching seabird behaviour. Gulls, puffins, guillemots, They're more reliable than any map when you know what you're looking at. Some are coastal nesters, some fly long distances, some always return to land at night. If they're heading somewhere with purpose, you follow them. Then there's the colour of the ocean itself. You hadn't noticed until now, but Eric points it out. See that stripe? Where it goes from grey to green-blue? That's shallower water. Continental shelf. We're moving into something different. It's like watching a watercolour change shades beneath your feet. Quirky fact time. Some Viking sailors even tasted the seawater to detect changes. Not exactly a gourmet method, but they swore the flavour told them when they were nearing river mouths or ice melt from Greenland. And yes, that means they drank a lot of gross seawater in the name of navigation. Salty, scientific, and just a little bit insane. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about just how advanced this environmental navigation really was. Some believe Viking sailors had an almost mythic intuition for the sea, built from lifetimes of observation and oral tradition. Others argue it's been exaggerated, that they mostly hugged coastlines, and the long-haul trips across the open Atlantic were rare flukes. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Clearly they made it, often enough to settle in places like Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America. But how many didn't make it? That part doesn't get carved into sagas. Back on deck, the crew shifts the sail to catch the new wind angle. It's a delicate balance. Too much wind, and the sail tears. Too little, and you drift like a lost log. The longship leans, responding smoothly, and you feel the change beneath your feet. The ship picks up speed, cutting the waves with a kind of hungry confidence. You start to see the navigation patterns all around you now. The sky's not just grey, it's layered, stacked in streaks and textures that tell stories. The birds don't just fly, they signal. Even the wind has a flavour, a feel, a rhythm. It's not just blowing, it's informing. One of the older sailors, Brynjar, pulls you aside and hands you something smooth and cloudy white. A crystal. You hold it up, unsure what to do with it. He grins, gaps in his teeth. "Find the sun," he says. You raise it toward the sky, turning it slowly, until a faint beam glows within the stone, like a trapped ember. Even through cloud cover, the sunstone gives away the sun's hidden position. Is it magic? Not quite. Just clever physics that Viking brains figured out centuries before anyone else thought to try them. You can't help but marvel at how deeply these people are tuned into their environment. It's not mystical, it's practical, and it's earned. Every creak of the hull, every screech of a seabird, every cloud formation is a signal they've spent their lives learning how to read. While you're just trying not to freeze your fingers off, they're having full conversations with the sky. Eric steps past you again and nods. West by south. If the birds stay straight, we hit land in 5 days. 6, if the gods are bored. He's not joking, there's always a healthy bit of fatalism in the mix. You never expect to arrive, you just keep going until you do, or you don't. By late afternoon, the ship has settled into its new rhythm. The oars rest, the sail pulls steady, and the crew relaxes relatively. Some patch gear, others mend torn gloves or rewrap their feet. One man sharpens his knife on a piece of shale, more from habit than necessity. You sit beside the mast, crystal in hand, watching the birds arc westward. You feel a strange sensation in your chest. Not warmth exactly, but its distant cousin. Orientation. You're not lost anymore. You're part of the ship, the crew, the birds, the sea. You're going somewhere. Not by compass, not by map, but by observation, memory, and instinct passed down through generations that refuse to freeze or starve or get eaten by sea monsters. Night creeps in again. You don't bother asking the time. The light fades slowly, then all at once, and the stars wink through like hesitant fireflies. The crew settles into silence. Someone hums a low song under their breath. You feel the ship tilt just slightly, Paul. A correction made without a word, and you smile in the dark. You're not on course by luck. You're on course by legacy. You start to notice it after about a week at sea. The edge in everyone's voice, the way people breathe just a little heavier when someone brushes past them. You've been sleeping shoulder to shoulder with the same dozen half-frozen Vikings for days, sharing food that smells like bad decisions, clothes that haven't been dry since launch, an air that's equal parts salt, sweat, and unspoken judgment. The ship might be moving west, but everyone's patience is sailing in the opposite direction. There's no privacy here. No corners to hide in, no closed doors, not even a blanket you can pull over your head without someone's foot ending up in your armpit. Every inch of this longship is communal. You sleep next to the guy who snores like a dying walrus. You eat beside the one who chews with his mouth open, and you row with the guy who keeps clearing his throat like he's about to deliver a sermon, but never does. This is where Viking survival becomes just as much about managing people as managing the cold. Eric, naturally, is immune. He moves through the crew like a seasoned mountain goat, sure-footed, indifferent, and too grizzled to care about interpersonal drama. But the rest of the crew, oh, it's simmering. You can feel it in the way one guy keeps accidentally jabbing his neighbour with an elbow during rowing, or how someone's pack was mysteriously soaked in bilge water overnight. These aren't accidents. They're petty cold weather vendettas. And the worst part? There's no fire to gather around and let off steam, literally or metaphorically. No cosy hearth for storytelling, no warm glow to soften moods, just cold faces in the dark, and the occasional warm fart under a blanket if you're lucky. Here's your historical fact. Viking longships didn't have living quarters. The entire crew lived on deck, exposed to the elements. On shorter voyages or during raids, it wasn't a big deal, but on transatlantic crossings, this could mean weeks in freezing temperatures huddled together with little more than fur cloaks and body heat for warmth. Scholars believe the social rules aboard ship were strict but unwritten. Don't take more space than you need. Don't hoard food. And for Odin's sake, don't complain unless you're bleeding. You learn quickly that the real key to surviving without fire isn't wool or fat or dry boots. It's not stabbing someone in their sleep when they eat the last piece of dried fish. The true heat of the ship comes from restraint. Brynjar, the older sailor with the sunstone, puts it best. Out here, your temper costs more than your fingers. He says this after breaking up a scuffle between two younger crewmen who nearly came to blows over whether someone's bedroll had been moved or used as a latrine. It's unclear. No one's asking follow-up questions. You start noticing how people manage themselves. They don't vent. They don't rant. They just do. If they're angry, they row harder. If they're frustrated, they tie knots tighter. If they're sad, they don't let it show. There's a kind of emotional minimalism here that makes sense when you realise there's nowhere to hide a breakdown. Not on a ship this size, and not in a world where survival depends on the person next to you not hating your guts. Quirky fact: there's evidence that Viking crews developed certain ritualistic behaviours to manage tension. Rhythmic chanting while rowing, competitive storytelling, even formalised insults, what scholars call flighting, to allow a safe outlet for aggression. Imagine a roast battle in the middle of the Atlantic, with your life depending on not crying if someone calls your beard patchy. You even witness a bit of flighting one night. Two men, bored and half frozen, start trading insults while sharpening their blades. At first it's playful, then it gets weirdly poetic. Something about someone's mother being a troll and their boat handling like a goat on ice. The whole crew listens, chuckling, and when it ends with a dramatic fart and exaggerated bow, the tension breaks. Just like that, no fire needed, just good old-fashioned verbal violence. There's a scholarly debate about how much of Viking culture encouraged this kind of verbal sparring. Some researchers argue it was vital to maintaining group cohesion, especially during long voyages. Others think it was more performative. Ritualized behaviour meant to entertain rather than resolve real conflict. But on this ship, watching two grown men rhyme threats about each other's cooking, it's hard to believe it wasn't a coping mechanism. Of course, not all conflict is fun and games. You see it in the small things, the way someone starts hoarding their ration pouches under their cloak instead of storing them communally, or how someone else always wakes up just a little too close to your gear, like they're testing boundaries. There's a grim understanding aboard the ship. If anyone loses control, everyone pays. That's where leadership becomes more than steering the ship. Eric doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His authority is bone deep, worn into him like his woolen tunic. When he raises an eyebrow, people shut up. When he nods, they move. He's a walking peace treaty and a quiet threat rolled into one. You find yourself mimicking the others, shrinking your presence when space is tight, offering food without being asked, laughing at bad jokes because it oils the gears of survival. You've never been closer to other people while feeling so far from comfort. One night, as the ship rocks gently and the sky clears just enough to show a spill of stars, you're all gathered under the sail for shelter. Someone starts singing. It's not a song you know. Low, slow, more a hum than a melody. It rolls across the deck like a blanket, and slowly the others join in. Not loudly, just enough to let the night know they're not afraid of it. You hum along, and for a moment, the chill in your spine fades, replaced by something that doesn't require fire to exist. Connection. That quiet collective understanding that you're all here, frozen and exhausted and still pushing west. Eventually the song fades. No applause, just silence and the occasional cough. Someone shifts beside you, the wood groaning under the weight. And you pull your cloak tighter, pressing your knees to your chest. You won't sleep well, you never do, but you'll sleep without fear that the man next to you will snap and push you overboard. And that's worth something. There's no fire here, no hearth. But in this floating, freezing, fart-scented huddle of strangers turned crewmates, you've found the smallest flicker of warmth anyway. You're soaked again. Not the light drizzle kind of soaked that makes you mildly uncomfortable, but the kind that makes every article of clothing cling to your body like it's plotting your demise. The longship has been cutting through a stretch of open sea where the spray laps over the railings like it's auditioning for a circus. And the wind? It's biting hard now, cold enough that your teeth ache even when you're not talking. This is the part no one writes sagas about, the long, slow rot of comfort. You're not bleeding in a glorious battle. You're not discovering new land with your hair blowing majestically in the breeze. You're shivering in boots that haven't been dry since day 2, and your toes feel like they're auditioning for an early amputation. There's no fire to dry anything, obviously. Fire on a longship is still just a good way to die wet and on fire, which is not the Viking ideal. So instead, your body has to do all the work. You stay warm by moving, not sitting. You stay dry by accepting that you won't. You stay alive by out-stubborning the ocean. Here's your historical fact. Viking clothing wasn't waterproof in the modern sense, but it was extremely clever. Layers of coarse, oily wool created natural water resistance. Outer garments, like cloaks and hoods, were often woven tighter and sometimes rubbed with animal fat beeswax, or even lanolin left naturally in the wool. Underneath that, softer tunics and leggings helped wick moisture away from the skin. But nothing truly kept you dry, not in a longship, not in the North Atlantic, not under endless spray and sleet. The trick was staying warm while wet. And it is a trick. You've been cycling between damp, soaked, and dripping for days now. Your boots, rough leather with layers of wool stuffed inside, make squishing sounds when you walk. Not exactly stealthy. And every time you sit, the cold seeps into your rear end like it's tunnelling into your soul. The crew barely notices anymore. Everyone's in some stage of soggy. A few have stopped bothering to wipe their faces when spray hits. Others have developed this sort of dry cough that comes and goes, more annoying than alarming. No one's gotten frostbite yet, but you've heard Eric quietly muttering about fingers and ears to keep an eye on. One sailor, Arne, seems to have taken the wet foot situation as a personal challenge. He removes his boots every night and wrings out his wool socks like he's milking a goat. His feet are red and blotchy and vaguely purple around the toes, but he insists he's fine. "I've lost toes before," he says cheerfully. "Didn't slow me down, just made my boots cheaper." You laugh, but you also keep a close eye on your own feet. You've learned to strip off your wet socks when you sleep, replacing them with the driest pair you can find, usually stiff with salt and half frozen. But even that little change helps. Your feet are sore, sure, and the skin between your toes has the texture of pickled onions, but you're not losing them yet. Quirky fact, the Vikings had a few tricks for dealing with perpetual wetness. Some wore moss inside their boots, not for padding, but for its natural absorbency and antibacterial properties. Others used sealskin, which, when oiled, was almost waterproof. And in especially desperate moments, there are accounts of warriors wrapping their feet in dried fish skins for a sort of emergency waterproof sock. You haven't tried that yet. Yet. The biggest problem isn't even the wetness. It's what comes with it. Blisters turn into ulcers, cuts don't heal, skin softens until it tears easily. And with no fire, there's no way to dry bandages or boil water for cleaning wounds. So instead, they rely on old remedies, herbs wrapped in cloth, moss soaked in vinegar, and poultices made from fermented fat and crushed bark. Eric's got a small pouch tied to his belt with what looks like black powder inside. You ask about it. He grunts. Oak ash and salt keeps the rot out. Apparently it's smeared onto raw skin to prevent infection. It stings like hell, he says, but it beats watching your foot turn black and fall off, which is a pretty low bar, but one you now respect deeply. The scholarly debate here is all about footwear. Archaeologists argue over whether Vikings wore soft-soled boots or hard leather shoes for long voyages. Some believe they used multiple layers, like a sock, then a wrap, then an outer shoe. Others suggest they mostly went barefoot on the ship and only donned proper shoes when on land. But whatever the truth, what's clear is this: no one stayed dry. They just adapted. You find yourself copying the crew's habits. You hang your socks from the mast rigging, letting the wind slap them into submission. You rub your feet with animal fat stolen from your last meal, hoping it acts as a barrier. You even try tucking moss inside your boots. It squishes, but your feet stop stinging, so you count it as a win. One day, while scooping water out of the bilge, a job no one wants but everyone has to do, you find a little bundle tucked behind the barrel. It's a cloth pouch, tied shut with twine. Inside, dried sage, pine resin, and some kind of flower. It smells shockingly pleasant. You take a deep breath and feel something you haven't felt in a while. Clean. It's not actually clean, but like the memory of clean. You ask Brinjar about it, and he nods. Herb bundle. Keeps your nose happy. Keeps the lice nervous. Apparently small bundles like that were common on long voyages. Not for hygiene, no one's bathing, but for morale. A tiny scent, small comfort, something that reminds your brain of warm places and safe beds. That night you sleep with the bundle under your nose, tucked inside your cloak. Your socks are still damp, your boots are crusty with salt, but the scent of sage drifts in as you close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine a dry room with a hearth, a fire, and the blessed sound of silence. But even that's just a fantasy. Tomorrow your boots will still be soaked, your cloak still frozen at the hem, and your body still damp in places you didn't know could get damp. And yet you'll wake up, you'll bail water, you'll row, and you'll keep going west, because fire might be comfort, but grit is survival. You don't know how you're sleeping at all anymore. It's less like sleep and more like short, shaky intervals of unconsciousness interrupted by cold water dripping from above, someone's elbow in your ribs, or the distant crack of wood groaning under the weight of ice. But somehow your body insists on collapsing every night, if only because staying awake would be a worse form of punishment. There's no bed. You're lying flat on the ship's deck, your head nestled into a bundle of spare clothes that are barely less damp than your cloak. You've tried every position, on your back, on your side, curled up, stretched out, and none of them are comfortable because again you're lying on wood. Wet, uneven, frost-covered wood. You'd think by now you'd be numb to it, and in a way you are. But numb doesn't mean comfortable. It just means you've accepted your suffering as the baseline. Tonight the ship rocks gently, more like a cradle than a death trap. You're grateful for that. The sea has its moods, and when it's not throwing tantrums, you almost feel like you're floating inside the belly of something ancient and tired. Here's your historical fact. Viking longships weren't just cramped, they were crushingly tight. Sleeping arrangements were minimal. The crew took turns lying down between rowing shifts, sometimes under a stretched piece of canvas or a fur pelt if they were lucky. There were no hammocks, no sleeping quarters below deck, just you, your wet cloak, and whatever you could curl around to keep warm. The crew's gotten used to the rotation. No one gets a full night's sleep. Instead, they rest in intervals, often with their heads toward the centre, and feet to the sides to save space. There's no snoring anymore, just the deep, shallow breathing of people who are too cold to sleep well and too exhausted to stay awake. Occasionally someone murmurs in their sleep. You once heard a man mutter about honey cakes, and you nearly cried. Your own dreams are strange now, fragmented, like bits of overheard conversation stitched together with the ocean spray and creaking wood. You dream of fire constantly, not dramatic infernos, just a single warm hearth, a flickering flame, the soft hiss of fat on a pan. Sometimes you dream you're dry, which is weirder because you wake up feeling like a wrung-out rag. You shift again, trying to tuck your hands beneath your thighs for warmth. Someone beside you stirs and mutters a half apology, another shuffle, another elbow. Space is currency here, and no one's rich. The worst part is when you have to relieve yourself. There's no bathroom, no privacy, and no safe spot. You crawl toward the edge, grip the railing with frozen fingers, and pray the sea doesn't decide to take you as payment for peeing. Wind whips at your cloak, and the cold makes every part of the process unnecessarily theatrical. But you get it done, and you get back to your spot like nothing happened, because out here, dignity is a long-forgotten luxury. Quirky fact. Some Viking ships carried communal poop buckets for emergencies, especially in bad weather when leaning over the side was a death sentence. These buckets, usually lined with moss or straw, would be dumped overboard at dawn, but on long hauls like this, most of the time, It was either overboard or hold it until you saw land. And if you think that's unpleasant, imagine trying to do it with 20 other people pretending not to watch you. Back under your cloak, the cold creeps in again. You breathe through your nose slowly, trying to trick your brain into thinking it's warmer than it is. You're surrounded by bodies, and that helps a little. The shared heat of 15 other humans packed like smoked fish under furs makes for a miserable but effective furnace. You ask Eric one night when he's on watch how he deals with it. He shrugs. You get used to the wood. You stop needing fire. Sleep becomes something you owe the sea. You don't know what that means, but it sounds poetic enough to let it go. There's a scholarly debate about whether Vikings ever constructed makeshift tents or partial shelters on deck for sleeping. Some experimental archaeologists argue they may have used overlapping shields or sailcloth as low shelters to break the wind. Others believe the deck was kept clear to allow for constant rowing and mobility in rough conditions. Most agree that if any shelter existed, it was minimal and reserved for the sick or the elderly. Tonight, though, there's no such luck. Just the wide open sky, the occasional flurry of snow dusting your face, and the constant creak of the ship shifting under your back. At some point in the night, someone's foot ends up on your leg. You shift, groan, and try to ignore it. What are you going to do? Move? To where? Someone else starts coughing, a deep wheezing sound that goes on too long. You don't open your eyes, but you listen. After a few minutes, it fades. The cougher rolls over. Sleep, or something like it, returns. You doze in and out, counting the seconds between waves, letting the rhythm lull you. There's no clock, no moon tonight. Just the passage of cold time and the occasional snore that doubles as a lullaby. Your shoulders gone numb. Your toes have stopped aching, which is somehow more worrying than when they did. By early morning, the sky begins to shift again. A faint brightness at the edge of the world. Not quite sunrise, just less darkness. Someone near the mast stands and stretches, joints cracking, then immediately regrets it and ducks back under his cloak. The rest of you begin to stir like molasses rolling uphill. You sit up, stiff and cold and covered in a thin crust of frost. Your breath fogs around you as you flex your fingers. The deck is wet again. It's always wet. You're not sure if you've actually dried off once since leaving port. You'll eat something sour and chewy soon. You'll haul on ropes. You'll row. But right now you sit in silence, watching the sea, and marvelling at the fact that you somehow made it through another night without fire, without a bed, and without losing your mind. The ship creaks. Someone farts under a fir. The sun fails to rise again, and you, a human icicle in a wool cocoon, close your eyes for 30 more seconds before the work begins all over again. There's a strange patch of pain creeping across the tops of your thighs, just under the edges of your belt and over the damp wool that's been pressing into your skin for, 10 days now, maybe longer. The voyage is starting to blur. The days are identical, cold, grey and wet. The night's colder, greyer and somehow even wetter. But your body knows what the calendar doesn't. Something's not right. When you peel back your outer layer later that morning, you see it. Red patches, inflamed, raw, a shallow sore where your waistband has rubbed against soaked wool for too long. You wince as you prod it. It's not deep yet, but you know what this could turn into. One man lost part of his calf to something similar back on day 4. It started as a blister, ended as a hole. This is when you discover the Viking version of skincare. Brynjar sees you poking at the spot and shuffles over with a worn pouch on his belt. Without saying much, he pulls out a small wooden jar with a cracked lid. He dips 2 fingers in and scoops out a thick, greenish-brown paste, then offers it to you like it's obvious what to do. You hesitate. "Spread it," he says. "Not too much. Rub it in, not on." You do as you're told. It smells like pine, burnt honey, and something vaguely sour. It stings, but the kind of sting that tells you it's working. You sit there, exposed thighs steaming slightly in the cold as the salve sinks into your skin. Brynjar nods, closes the jar and walks away like, this is just another Tuesday. Here's your historical fact. Viking Age medicine relied heavily on herbal remedies, poultices, and salves, especially when fire wasn't available to sterilize or cauterize. They used a wide range of local plants like yarrow, juniper, plantain and birch bark, often as mixed with animal fat or beeswax to create healing balms. These were applied to everything from open wounds to chapped skin, and in the absence of flame they were the only line of defense against the slow death of infection. The crew treats it like normal because it is. Everyone on this ship has some version of the same problem: abrasions, rashes, frost-nipped toes, cracked fingers. There's no heat to dry wounds, no hot water to clean them, no linen bandages fresh from a fire. There's just ointment, moss, and the hope that your skin stays intact until you reach land. Quirky fact for you, Vikings were known to chew bark, particularly willow or birch, not just for the taste, which was frankly awful, but because they understood its medicinal value. Birch bark contains compounds similar to modern-day salicylic acid, the main ingredient in aspirin. So yes, in a roundabout way, they were microdosing nature's painkillers while rowing through freezing hell. You find a strip of birch in the medical pouch later that day and try it. It tastes like bitter wood, but your legs do feel a little better. As the day wears on, more ailments reveal themselves. Arn has a cracked heel that keeps bleeding every time he steps wrong. He wraps it in wool soaked with pine resin and holds it together with rawhide strips. Another man's fingernail has gone black from a rope burn turned abscess. Brynjar lances it with a bone needle that looks disturbingly well used. The man doesn't scream, he just chews on a leather strap and mutters a prayer to Thor. There's a scholarly debate here that still stirs up arguments among researchers. How much did Viking medical knowledge actually help in cases of infection or serious injury? Some argue their herbalism and wound care were surprisingly effective given the lack of fire or antiseptic. Others believe their successes were more about luck and natural resilience than true medical understanding. But you're seeing it firsthand now. The salves, the bark, the moss, the whispered prayers. Whatever the science, something's working. The sick are surviving. The wounded are still rowing. You notice that some of the crew wear small pouches of dried herbs around their necks. Not for healing exactly, but for prevention. They believe the scent wards off rot. One man swears that the right mix of sage, juniper, and crushed garlic kept him from catching the gut wind during a storm near Ireland. You're not sure what gut wind is, but you never want to find out. There are other little tricks you pick up. Wrapping your fingers with narrow strips of leather before rowing to prevent cracking. Tying a strip of cloth over your nose at night to stop your nostrils from freezing shut. Stuffing wool under your arms, not just for warmth, but to soak up sweat before it turns your tunic into a wet rag. These aren't luxuries. They're survival hacks passed down from people who didn't need YouTube to figure out how to not die. Late in the afternoon, Eric does a full body check of the crew. Not for discipline, just health. He walks up and down the ship, checking the faces, poking at bandages, demanding to see hands and feet. One man tries to hide a split knuckle. Eric sees it anyway. He orders Brynjar to rub in the salve and wrap it, then smacks the man on the back like he's just doing his part to hold the ship together. You wonder when the next real crisis will hit. You've already dodged frostbite once and your thighs are healing, but someone's going to get something worse soon. An infection, a deep wound, maybe worse. And with no fire, no boiling water, and no sterile anything, the solution will probably involve a knife and a prayer. That night you sleep with your cloak wrapped tightly around your waist, protecting your healing skin. Your legs still ache, but not like before. The salve is working. Your breath fogs against the inside of your hood, and the air smells faintly of pine and rot. You hear someone groan nearby as they shift onto a sore shoulder. Another man grunts and mutters something about lice. You close your eyes and try to dream of warmth, of a fire crackling somewhere inside a dry room, of a warm hand on your shoulder and a bowl of soup you can't drop through a crack in the deck. But that's not your world right now. Your world is ointment, salt, wool, and stubbornness. And while it doesn't make for a romantic saga, it's keeping you and the crew alive. Just barely. It's well past midnight, or maybe it's barely morning. Hard to say. The sky doesn't shift much anymore. Just an eternal dome of cold grey that sometimes gets lighter, sometimes darker, depending on whether the clouds feel like letting you pretend the sun still exists. But tonight, or this particular version of night, there's a peculiar silence on deck. No snoring, no grumbling, just the creak of wet wood and the slap of water against the hull. Then you hear it. A low hum, almost melodic. Someone's voice, weaving through the silence, soft and slow. Like a lullaby meant more for the sea than for human ears. You shift under your stiff cloak and rise just enough to peek around the mast. There, near the prow, sits Eric, cross-legged, eyes half closed, humming to himself. His breath curls upward like smoke, vanishing into the gloom. You hadn't expected prayer, not from him. You shuffle closer, quietly, settling down beside a pile of coiled rope. Eric doesn't look over, just keeps humming. Then when the song stops, he speaks. Not to you, not really to anyone. Thor for strength, Njord for calm seas, Freya for warmth, and Odin just so he doesn't notice us. You wait. He glances over eventually. You never ask the gods for too much, he mutters. They get suspicious, especially in weather like this. Here's your historical fact. Viking seafarers were deeply spiritual, and not just in the swing swords and shout Valhalla way pop culture loves to replay. They carried charms, amulets, and invoked the gods regularly, especially at sea. Thor was the protector, his hammer symbol etched into tools and worn as pendants. Njord, the god of the sea and wind, was often appealed to for safe travel. And Odin? Well, Odin was the god of wisdom, war, and fate, which meant he could grant you safe passage, or decide it was time you joined the seabed. Eric reaches into his tunic and pulls out a small pendant. Thor's hammer, hand-carved from bone, edges worn smooth from years of gripping. He kisses it once, tucks it back in, then stands without another word. You're left alone with the wind and a dozen sleeping crewmates who might not admit it, but all pray in their own ways too. The funny part? There's no fire, no altar, no smoke curling from sacred incense. These prayers are whispered into frozen wind, hummed into salt air, muttered over blisters and frostbitten toes. The gods don't need warmth to hear you. Maybe that's why they travel so well. Quirky fact, some Viking sailors kept small carved idols tucked into the ship's structure, hidden in the prow, tied to the mast, or wedged between planks beneath the tiller. These were vetir, spirits of protection, often wood or bone figurines believed to guard the voyage. Offerings weren't burned, obviously, but scattered. Bits of food tossed into the sea, drops of mead, or even tufts of hair in particularly desperate moments. One night you see a crewmate, Trygve, slide something small and wrapped in cloth into a crack in the deck. He doesn't notice you watching, but later, after the others fall asleep, you crawl over and peek. It's a lock of blonde hair tied with sinew. Maybe his wife's, maybe a child's, maybe someone long gone. Doesn't matter. It's a prayer now. There's a scholarly debate about how religious Viking seafarers really were. Some argue their belief systems were more cultural habits than active faith. Things done out of tradition, not fear or reverence. Others point to the number of amulets, idols, and written runes found at burial sites and shipwrecks as proof that the sea brought out deep spiritual behaviour. After all, nothing makes you believe in the supernatural quite like being tossed around by a force you can't punch. At some point in the early morning, the ship hits a patch of stillness. The waves flatten, the wind drops to a hush, and the stars, peek through for the first time in days. It's eerie. Like stepping into a space the world forgot. The crew stirs, one by one, squinting upward as if they've never seen the sky. Brynjar, still chewing his birch bark like it's a fine delicacy, looks up and mutters, "The gods are watching." You glance at the stars, clearer now than any map. You see the familiar constellations twisted slightly by the curve of northern sky. The Dipper, the Hunter, the Serpent. The Vikings used these too, not just the sun and sea. They track stars across seasons, mapping their courses by the sky's rhythm. But on nights like this, it feels less like navigation and more like a reminder that you're a speck. One of the younger sailors begins softly reciting part of a saga. You don't recognise the lines, but the cadence is familiar. Epic verse spoken aloud, the kind that fills cold air with stories of gods, monsters, and men who were colder than you and still came out heroes. It's comforting in its own strange way, not fire, not warmth, but memory, tradition, and the shared illusion that you're not doing something completely insane. You realise that this cold, this hardship, this near-hopeless voyage across frozen waters, it wasn't just about conquest or curiosity. It was devotion. To the gods, to glory, to the idea that surviving something brutal meant you were chosen. Whether by fate, luck, or divine favour didn't matter. What mattered was that you made it, and that others would remember you did. You roll over onto your side, facing the mast. The ship creaks, but gently. You can hear Eric walking the perimeter, slow and deliberate, a shadow against the starlight. No one else moves. The cold is still sharp, but for now the wind is still. The sea is quiet. And for once your thoughts don't immediately drift to fire or dry socks. They drift to the gods, those old, cold beings drifting just outside sight, nodding along as their frostbitten children brave a world that would rather drown them. You press your hand to your chest and whisper a name you've heard repeated in hushed moments between waves. Njord. You don't know if he's listening. But out here, even silence feels like a reply. The sea is angry today. Not the dramatic, towering wave kind of angry you see in paintings. No, this is worse. This is the slow, creeping rage of a sea that's done pretending to be kind. The wind howls, not a scream, but a steady, low moan that sounds like it's echoing from beneath the ocean itself. The sky is the colour of hammered lead, the clouds sagging so low they seem to press down on the ship. And scattered all across the horizon are the shapes you've been warned about since day one. Icebergs. They rise like sleeping giants, their tops worn smooth by wind and time, their underbellies stretching far below the surface where the real danger lies. You can see them now, dotting the horizon like an army of ghost ships. Each one floats silently, indifferent, patient, beautiful in the way predators often are. This is the part of the journey where your instinct to survive and your ability to keep your pants dry are now in direct conflict. The ship groans as it cuts through the black water, a few slushy chunks of sea ice knocking against the hull like warning taps, nothing heavy yet, but you know it's coming. Here's your historical fact: the Vikings regularly encountered sea ice and icebergs as they voyaged westward, particularly on the routes from Iceland to Greenland and beyond. These waters were cold and treacherous even in the summer months, and pack ice could crush wooden ships like twigs. There's even some evidence in sagas and archaeological studies that entire expeditions were lost in the ice, with only driftwood and ghost stories washing ashore. The crew is quiet today. No singing, no insults, just focused eyes and hands gripping ropes, adjusting sail tension, watching the water like it might leap up and eat them. Which frankly it could. You're crouched beside the prow, peering out through the mist. A wall of white appears dead ahead, an iceberg, massive and glistening, casting its own eerie light through the fog. It's far enough that you're not panicking, but close enough to taste fear on your tongue. You glance back at Eric, who's already adjusting course, shouting commands you barely hear over the wind. And then it happens. Crack. A chunk of submerged ice scrapes along the hull. The sound isn't loud, but it vibrates through your feet and straight into your spine. You feel the ship shudder, just slightly, and everyone freezes. No one breathes. For one long second, all you hear is the water licking the sides of the ship. Then, nothing. The ship holds. The hull didn't breach, no cold rush of water, just a warning. Quirky fact: the Viking longships, with their flexible overlapping planks and shallow drafts, could often survive glancing blows from sea ice that would destroy the heavier, deeper draft vessels. Some experts argue this was partially accidental genius, more to do with their need for river navigation and beach landings than ice navigation, but it gave them a fighting chance in these frozen waters. Still, it's a fine line between that was close and everyone freeze to death now. Eric orders half the crew to take up oars. He wants more control over the ship's motion as they weave between icebergs. You leap into position and grab an oar, the wood slick with seawater and cold sweat. The rhythm is sharp, each pull cutting against the current. The ice field is denser now, like a frozen maze, and the longship glides forward like a cautious cat in a dog kennel. There's a scholarly debate about how navigable these icy waters were back then. Some say the conditions were milder 1,000 years ago, warmer summers, less sea ice, while others argue that Viking resilience had nothing to do with climate and everything to do with sheer force of will and absurd amounts of luck. Either way, you're not feeling particularly lucky right now. One of the bergs calves suddenly, an enormous slab of ice cracking off the mother block and slamming into the sea with a roar. The wave that follows rocks the ship hard, sending you sliding 1/2 metre along the deck before you scramble to hold your place. Water sloshes in. Someone yells. Another man is nearly knocked off his feet, but the crew stabilises the ship with practised ease. Your knuckles are white on the oar. You don't realise how hard you've been gripping it until Eric shouts, "Ease up, you'll snap your fingers before the ship." You force yourself to breathe. The mist thickens, visibility drops. The icebergs now loom like mountains, vague shapes in the fog. The air is freezing, sharper than it's been in days, and you can feel it sinking into your lungs. Every breath is like dragging knives down your throat. The crew rows harder, steering carefully between two close pillars of ice. They tower over the ship, eerily still. You know most of an iceberg is beneath the surface, hidden. That's the real danger. The shape below could snag the keel and drag you down so fast your soul wouldn't have time to call for Odin. But again, the ship holds. It always does. You pass through the narrows. The mist opens like a curtain, and for a moment the sea clears. A wide patch of open water. Relief is a physical thing. You can feel it like a weight slipping off your shoulders. Eric exhales. So do you. The worst of it is behind you. For now. Huddled under your cloak, you think about how fragile this whole operation is. One misplaced iceberg. One crack in the hull. One slip and the fireless world of cold sea becomes your coffin. But the ship keeps sailing, and so do you. The Vikings had no fire on these waters, no warm shelter, no forge to heat their bones, but they had knowledge. They had eyes that knew how to read the mist. They had a boat that bent but didn't break. And they had gods, old, quiet gods, who may or may not have been watching through the fog. Tonight, you sleep with your eyes half open. You dream of floating mountains and a sea that never forgives, but you're still here. And as Eric says, that means the gods haven't noticed you yet. When you finally make landfall after what feels like a century of rowing, praying, and trying not to become a Viking-shaped icicle, it's not the dramatic moment you expected. No cheering, no trumpets, no triumphant leap from the deck, just a sluggish dragging of limbs as the longship grinds up onto a gravelly, ice-slick shore, the hull creaking like it's sighing with relief. You made it. But the first thing you realise is that you still don't have fire. You squint at the shoreline, bleak, rocky and windblown. It's not the lush green paradise you were half hoping for. It's cold grey and dotted with boulders the size of horses. The sea behind you hisses against the rocks, like it's already annoyed you survived. And inland, bare scrub, some crusty lichen, and snow that looks like it never quite figured out how to melt. Welcome to Helluland, one of the first stops west of Greenland, if the sagas have it right. It literally means land of flat rocks, which is either an insult or just Viking honesty at its finest. You step onto land and expect to feel safer, warmer, something. Instead, your boots squish with every step, still soaked, and the cold wind follows you like a jealous ex. You pull your cloak tighter, glance around and realise your next problem. There are no trees, not a single one, just rocks, frost, and the occasional patch of some moss clinging to life like it owes someone money. Here's your historical fact. The Norse called this place Helluland, and historians now associate it with the coast of modern-day Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. It was likely their first point of landfall when heading west from Greenland, and it was, by all accounts, utterly inhospitable. No usable timber, little game, no soft soil. The sagas describe it as cold, stony and rough. You know, real estate gold. The longship is pulled halfway ashore by a dozen tired hands, its dragon head staring at the rocky coast like it too regrets this decision. Eric walks the perimeter, scanning the horizon. You can almost hear his thoughts. Where's the wood? Where's the food? Where's the fire? There is none. So what do you burn when there's nothing to burn? That's the question now. Everyone's wet, everyone's cold, everyone's muscles are screaming after days of rowing, and there's no warm fire to gather around. No pile of logs waiting to be split. Just a few pathetic pieces of driftwood that are so waterlogged they might as well be sea cucumbers. Eric sends out 2 small scouting parties to look for anything that can burn. You go with one, clambering up slick stone ridges and over icy creeks. The only thing you find is a half-rotted whalebone, and what might be a fox track if you squint and have a good imagination. You head back empty-handed, pockets full of disappointment. But Brynjar somehow returns with a handful of dried grass and a fist-sized chunk of something yellowish and crumbly. He grins. "Dung," he says, triumphant. "Reindeer, I think. Or something worse." The crew doesn't laugh, they nod. Because in a place like this, dung is not waste, it's potential. Here's your quirky fact. The Vikings and other Arctic peoples often used animal dung as fuel in treeless regions. Dried properly, it burns slow and hot enough to cook food or warm a shelter if you had a shelter. They also collected whale blubber and seal fat to use in oil lamps, sometimes mixing it with moss or lichen as a wick. Fire wasn't about crackling logs, it was about creative combustion. The crew starts gathering whatever they can. Driftwood, dried seaweed, moss, bones. Someone finds a partially mummified seal carcass and drags it back like it's treasure. It smells awful, but it might burn. That's all that matters. There's a scholarly debate over whether the Vikings built fires on these coastal stops at all or relied entirely on cold rations and body heat until they reached more hospitable land. Some evidence suggests they carried small quantities of fuel with them, charcoal wrapped in leather, maybe, but in places like Helluland that would run out fast. Others believe they scavenged every inch of shoreline for anything that would smoulder. You're beginning to believe the latter, especially now that your campfire is being built out of seaweed dung and sadness. Once the fuel pile is assembled, the problem becomes lighting it. You don't have matches. You don't even have flint with dry tinder. Everything is damp, greasy and miserable. But Brynjar, once again, proves useful. He pulls out a tiny leather pouch, opens it and shows you a bit of charred cloth, kept miraculously dry, and a chunk of flint. A few scrapes, a couple of sparks, and, by some kind of divine comedy, the dung catches. The fire is small, pathetic really, more smoke than flame, but it smells warm, and that's enough to draw the crew around it like moths who've given up on dignity. You sit in a circle, shoulders touching, watching the sad little fire sputter and belch as it eats its way through moss and sea-crusted bones. It's not fire in the glorious, flickering storytelling sense. It's fire as necessity. It hisses, coughs, and dies 3 times before Brynjar revives it again, muttering something that might be a spell or a very specific insult. Still, the warmth creeps in. You dry your gloves, sort of, warm the crusted toes of your boots, someone tries to heat a piece of fish, and it promptly blackens on one side while freezing on the other. But no one complains. Warmth is warmth, even if it's dung-powered. Later, as the fire gutters out, everyone wraps up in cloaks and leans against the longship for rest. You curl against the hull, the wood cool but familiar beneath your back. The land offers no comfort, but at least it isn't trying to drown you. You realise now how terrifying a world without fire really is. Not just because it's cold, but because it strips everything down, it makes you scavengers, it makes you desperate, it makes you burn things you'd never dream of calling fuel. And yet you're alive, on land, breathing. You close your eyes, listening to the faint crackle of a dying flame made from whale grease and dung, and you think, this is the ugliest fire you've ever seen, and you love it. The next day you wake up stiff, frozen and crusted with a thin layer of frost that makes your wool cloak feel like it's been dipped in glass. The fire from last night is long dead, just a sad smear of ash in a circle of blackened moss and bone. It didn't last long. Nothing does in Helluland. The rocks around you are just as grey and lifeless as yesterday. The ship sits on the shore like a stranded creature, its dragon-headed prow facing inland, like it's just as disappointed by the landscape as the rest of you. The crew moves slowly, nursing sore muscles and cracked hands, every movement accompanied by grunts and groans that speak less to pain and more to sheer exhaustion. You gather your things, still damp, still smelling like fish and sweat, and pack up. No one needs to be told. You're not staying here. There's nothing in Helluland but rocks, wind, and disappointment. No trees, no game, and certainly no future. By mid-morning, you're back on the ship, pushing off into the icy surf with boots still squishing from yesterday's failures. The sea welcomes you back with its usual warmth. None at all. You sail south, hugging the coast, the land on your right an unbroken chain of stone and snow. After a few days, it begins to change, slowly, subtly. The cliffs lower, patches of green appear, the shoreline dips into valleys where the snow melts just enough to hint at grass. You see birds, different kinds now, ones that don't just circle endlessly overhead, but dive into the sea and return with something wriggling in their beaks. And then, on the 5th day you see it, a coastline that actually looks like it might forgive you for existing. It's not paradise, but compared to Helluland, it's a full-blown resort. Eric says this is Markland, forest land. Likely the Labrador coast, and it lives up to its name. You can smell the trees before you see them. Pine and spruce, sharp and earthy, with a scent that makes the whole crew go quiet for a moment. It's like being invited back into civilization after squatting in nature's waiting room for weeks. Here's your historical fact. The Norse sagas describe Markland as a heavily forested region south of Helluland, rich in timber and wild animals. Archaeologists and scholars generally agree this refers to the Labrador coast of modern-day Canada. The Vikings prized this land, not for settlement, but for resources. Timber in particular was invaluable to the Greenlanders, whose icy home lacked usable trees for building or fire. As the ship coasts into a shallow bay, The men practically leap off the sides, scrambling up the shore and into the trees like children let out of school. You follow, boots sinking into actual soil for the first time in what feels like forever. The ground is soft, the air smells green, and you're no longer on a rock slab pretending to be land. The first thing Eric does? Orders wood gathered. Dry wood. Any wood. Fallen branches, snapped limbs, pine needles, anything that looks like it might catch flame and not fight back. The crew fans out, each man returning with armfuls of kindling as if fuel were gold. Soon there's a real fire. Not a dung fire, not a sad pile of damp moss hissing smoke into your face. A real crackling, pine-scented fire with flames tall enough to dance around. You feel it hit your face like a slap from the gods. Sharp, dry heat that sinks into your skin, your bones, your soul. You nearly cry. Maybe you do. No one says anything if they notice. They start drying clothes. Boots come off. Gloves are peeled away. Wet wool is draped across branches like a bizarre, smelly tapestry. The crew sits in a loose circle, legs stretched out toward the flames, steam rising from cloaks and tunics like spirits escaping. Someone throws a handful of pine needles into the fire, just to hear them sizzle. And here's your quirky fact: the Norse used fire as both a tool and a signal. In treeless regions, the first visible column of smoke rising into the sky meant more than warmth. It meant survival. It was a sign that the land had accepted them, even temporarily. In some sagas, men weep openly when they find dry fuel after long sea voyages. It wasn't just emotional, it was primal. The crew settles into the rhythm of fire like they've never been without it. Someone heats stones and places them near their feet. Another pokes the coals and mutters that the wood here burns like it was born knowing how. They roast strips of dried meat just for the luxury of eating something warm. It tastes better than any feast you've ever had. Even though it's just the same dried fish you've been gnawing on for days, the heat transforms it. Or maybe the warmth just makes everything taste like a blessing. There's a scholarly debate about whether the Vikings attempted to establish semi-permanent camps in places like Markland. Some say they did, temporary outposts for hunting and logging. Others argue it was strictly a supply stop, a place to raid the land for resources, load up and head back to Greenland. There's no conclusive archaeological evidence of permanent settlement here, but some believe remains could still be hidden beneath centuries of forest and frost. But standing here now, you understand why they considered it. You spend 2 days in Markland, 2 glorious days of real fires, dry socks, and drinking from streams that don't taste like ocean or despair. The crew repairs gear, rewraps handles, patches cloaks. You carve yourself a new spoon. Someone finds a patch of berries and nearly causes a stampede. It's not comfortable, not by modern standards, but it's survivable. And that's all anyone needs. On the second night, around a particularly impressive fire built from fallen spruce, Eric finally speaks about what comes next. Vinland, he says, if the wind holds, 2, maybe 3 more days. You feel a strange weight settle in your chest. You've come this far, across endless water, through ice and wind and the land of miserable rocks. And now there's more. Always more. But the fire's warm, the wood is dry, and for the first time in weeks you sleep with heat on your face instead of a freezing deck under your back. In the morning the ship's packed again. Heavier now, with bundles of pine and spruce, bark and dried moss. The fire burns down to embers, and one of the crew carefully wraps a glowing coal in a leather pouch, nestling it among the dried grass. A fire seed. Not for now, but for the next place where trees are a memory. You push off from Markland with a belly full of warmth and a little more hope than you had 2 days ago. And you can't help but smile, just a little, at the knowledge that finally your socks are dry. Markland fades behind you like a dream you didn't want to wake from. The fire, the dry boots, the soft ground, it all disappears with the first stroke of the oars and the creak of the sail catching the wind. The sea greets you again, cold and familiar, like a cranky landlord who wants rent and doesn't care if you've got frostbite. The journey south from Markland is faster than what came before, but no less brutal. The wind has turned, not against you, but not quite in your favour either. It's the kind of wind that makes you work for every mile, that fills your nose with salt and tries to sneak under your layers like an unwelcome hand. The coastline to the west is rugged and distant, a jagged ribbon of cliffs and forest you don't dare stray too far from. This part of the voyage is a game of balance, between keeping close enough to land to navigate, but far enough not to get dashed against the rocks by a rogue wave. On the second day, the weather breaks, and not in the good way. Clouds roll in, low and heavy, and soon the rain starts. But it's not a warm summer drizzle. It's the icy, soul-sapping kind that soaks your wool before you can even curse its arrival. The fire seed wrapped in leather and moss. Useless. No one dares risk lighting it in this wet wind. So once again, you're fireless, floating in a wet wooden coffin. This is the approach to Greenland, not the settled part, the icy shoulder of it, the eastern edge where the sea claws at the rocks and fog swallows the sky. Eric's made the decision to swing close, to search for a safe harbour before making the final push toward Vinland. Supplies are low, morale is worse, one of the oars cracked during the night. 2 men have stopped talking entirely, just blank stares and hands that move automatically, like puppets too cold to feel. You spot it near dusk, a narrow fjord hidden between cliffs, the water inside darker than ink. The ship turns in with aching groans, the crew rowing slowly now, conserving what little strength remains. The moment you enter the fjord, everything goes quiet. The wind drops, the sea calms, the world closes around you like a cave of stone and sky. The boat glides to a stop on a shore that is, to your eternal relief, solid ground. Not gravel, not wet boulders, actual earth. Eric calls it a landing of necessity. He doesn't pretend it's safe or promising, or even temporary, just necessary. Here's your historical fact. Vikings established multiple settlements in Greenland, most famously the eastern and western settlements. But the coasts were harsh, even by their standards. Farming was nearly impossible, and winters lasted most of the year. But it wasn't all ice. Some fjords, like the one you've landed in, offered small patches of habitable land, grassy pockets in a landscape of stone. As you step off the boat, your boots sink slightly into moss-covered earth. You almost cry, not from relief, though there's plenty of that, but from the sudden realization that your body has no idea what to do with soft terrain anymore. The crew moves like ghosts, no shouting, no orders. Everyone just knows. The tasks are the same. Gather what fuel you can, find shelter if there's any to be had, dry the worst of the wet gear. A few men start building a stone ring to protect the fire once they dare light it. You go off in search of driftwood and find something even better. A clump of tangled shrubs, dead but dry, their roots sticking out of the thin soil like bony fingers. You drag them back to camp, triumphant. It just smells like rot and old bark. But when Brynjar tests it with flint, it sparks. The fire is small, sputtering and smoky, but it exists. That alone is a victory. Quirky fact, in parts of Greenland, the Norse may do with unusual fuel sources, dried seaweed, bird bones, even old boat timbers from wrecked or abandoned ships. When they ran out of firewood, they burned their tools, fences, even sections of their homes. Fire wasn't just a luxury, it was a currency, and they burned anything that didn't scream when it caught flame. Tonight's fire smells like regret. Wet pine, damp moss, and something you're pretty sure is decomposing seabird. But it gives off enough heat to dry socks, boil water in a cracked pot, and keep frost from settling in your nose hairs. You press your palms toward it, eyes half closed, trying not to think too hard about how many days you've been out here, or how many more lie ahead. There's a scholarly debate about how long the Norse lasted in Greenland, and why they eventually disappeared. Some say climate change played a role, ushering in colder, longer winters during the Little Ice Age. Others point to overgrazing, trade isolation, or conflict with the Inuit, whose ability to survive without fire, using seal oil, igloos, and fur-lined everything far outmatched Norse stubbornness. Either way, the settlements vanished. Not overnight, but slowly, like fire guttering out in wet wood. The fjord grows colder after dark. Wind sneaks in over the cliff walls. You huddle close with the others, backs to the stones, knees to your chest. You share heat. You share food. No one's talking, just quiet chewing and the occasional muttered prayer or curse. The fire dies just before midnight. The wood was too damp. The moss burns quick and dies quicker. But no one panics. You've learned by now that cold isn't a moment. It's a mood. And like all moods, it passes. Or you stop noticing it. Hard to say which. You try to sleep with your head resting on a bundle of rope, your cloak pulled tight over your ears. The stars are hidden. The fire is gone. But the land, hard as it is, feels like a promise. A pause in the endless suffering, a place where your bones might dry out for once. Maybe this is all Greenland ever was. Not a home, not a paradise, just a pit stop between impossible oceans. You close your eyes, drifting off to the sound of the sea licking the rocks, and wonder, if this is the best it gets out here, what does Vinland have to offer? You wake up to the sound of something breathing heavily, not human, not close, but definitely alive. You freeze beneath your cloak, every muscle tensing like a trap springing shut. The fire's gone cold, just a ring of blackened stones with smoke curling up like a ghost refusing to leave. The crew around you stirs slowly, one or two sitting up, bleary-eyed and already annoyed. And then you hear it again, snuffling heavy and low, something moving through the frost just beyond the rise. Seal. Eric confirms it with a single word. He doesn't shout, doesn't leap up with a spear or bark orders like this is some glorious hunt. He just says, seal, and stands slowly, as if trying not to spook the weather. Because out here, hunting without fire isn't a sport. It's a negotiation with survival, and it has to be quiet. You and two others follow Eric as he moves up the rise. The ground crunches faintly beneath your feet. Frozen grass, half-dead moss, brittle stones, and when you reach the top you see it. A fat, dark shape dragging itself across the beach. It moves like an overstuffed bag of wet laundry. Its slick body shining with seawater and its head bobbing up and down as it sniffs the air. It hasn't seen you yet. Eric makes a hand signal. You fan out, crouched low, weapons ready. No bows, no arrows, too loud, too risky. This is a rush job, literally. When the signal comes, you run down the hill like maniacs, screaming, waving your arms, trying to confuse the beast just long enough to get close. The seal makes a senlay, a bark, and fops toward the water, but not fast enough. Eric leaps first, slams his weight onto it, and drives a bone-handled knife deep behind its head. It spasms. You help hold it down. It's brutal, it's as fast, and it's exactly what has to happen. Here's your historical fact. Seal hunting was essential to Viking survival in Arctic regions. Not just for meat, but for fat, skins and bones. The meat was eaten fresh, dried, or stored in ice. The fat was rendered into oil for lamps or mixed with herbs to preserve wounds and soften leather. Seal skins were waterproof and made excellent cloaks, boots, and even ropes. In Greenland especially, seal was often the most reliable source of sustenance through the long winters. You drag the carcass back to camp with the others, leaving a dark, smeared trail across the stones. The seal is heavy, easily 100 kilos, and still warm. That warmth is a gift, a strange, disturbing one, but a gift all the same. Everyone gathers around as the butchering begins. There's no ceremony, just efficiency. Eric and Brynjar know what they're doing. They start at the neck, cut through the thick skin, and begin peeling it back like opening a heavy wet coat. The fat is the real treasure here, thick white layers of it, gleaming even in the dim morning light. It's cut into chunks and passed into greasy hands, some to be eaten, some to be stored. You chew a piece raw, as rubbery, oily, and somehow both foul and necessary. Coat your mouth and throat like warm candle wax, and it's glorious. Quirky fact, seal fat burns like a dream. If you soak moss in it and light it with a spark, it acts like a slow-burning candle. Arctic peoples used it for lamps for centuries. Vikings borrowed the trick, especially in Greenland, where wood was too rare to waste. And a pouch of seal fat and a handful of moss could keep a shelter lit and warm enough to stave off frostbite through the night. Not a blazing hearth, but a steady glow, just enough to feel human. You help render some of the fat into oil. No big cauldrons, no roaring flames, just a shallow bowl set near what remains of the campfire's coals. The process is slow. The fat melts sluggishly, bubbling and hissing, giving off a sharp, greasy scent. You dip a piece of cloth into the oil-soaked moss and light it with flint. It smoulders, then catches. A flickering flame dances in the bowl, weak but steady. Someone laughs, softly, incredulously, because this isn't firewood. It's not a torch, it's seal fat, and it's light. There's a scholarly debate about just how much the Norse borrowed from indigenous Arctic practices. Some argue they developed their own techniques independently, while others believe contact with Inuit and other native groups led to the adoption of tools like skimboats, snow goggles and oil lamps. But the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Survival doesn't care who thought of something first, it only cares that it works. By late afternoon the camp is alive in a strange, quiet way. Clothes hang from branches again, drying in the weak sunlight. Strips of seal meat are laid on rocks to air out, slowly stiffening into a sort of makeshift jerky. A shallow trench has been dug and lined with hide to collect more oil from rendered blubber. It's a crude operation, but it feels like progress. Eric tells you that seal oil will be packed into hollowed out bones and carried with you on the next leg of the voyage. Fuel for cooking, light, and sometimes even medicine. Good for the joints, he says, rubbing some into his knuckles. You do the same. It feels awful, but warm, and that's enough. That night, the wind picks up again. Not a storm, but a bitter breeze that cuts through the fjord like a knife through seal fat. You huddle close to one of the shallow oil lamps, cupping your hands around the flickering light. It's small. Ridiculous, really. A candle in the canyon. But it gives off enough heat to warm your fingers, enough glow to see the outlines of your crewmates hunched under cloaks, chewing silently. You sleep near it. Not by choice, there is still barely enough room, but out of some primal instinct. Fire, even fake fire, draws us in. You dream of nothing, or maybe something that feels like a deep black sea with lights bobbing on its surface. When you wake, the flame is still burning. Barely, but it's there. And in this world of ice and wind and darkness, that counts for everything. You see them before they see you. It starts with the sound, quick rhythmic slapping on the water, like a seal's tail but sharper, more deliberate. Then the shapes emerge through the mist. Low, narrow boats riding the swells like leaves, gliding with a quiet grace that puts your dragon-proud longship to shame. At first you think they're whales, maybe driftwood. But then you see the arms, the paddles, and the figures cloaked in fur, faces hidden beneath hoods, and you realise these aren't Vikings, these are Skraelings. That's what the Norse call them anyway. Skraelings. It roughly translates to screamers or shouters, though no one on those boats is making any noise right now. The term appears in the sagas as like a catch-all for the indigenous peoples encountered in Greenland and beyond, Inuit, Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, and others. But out here, names are irrelevant. What matters is that they're not you, and you're not them. The boats close in, not in a hostile way, just curious. Their design is alien to your crew. They're made of bones and hin, stitched with sinew, and curved like crescents. The paddlers move in perfect sync, dipping and pulling with almost no splash, navigating the coastal chop with ease. These are kayaks, what modern ears would call kayaks. But to you, they look like the sea invented its own kind of longship and never bothered to ask permission. Your crew stiffens. Hands drift toward weapons, Brynjar mutters under his breath, and Eric raises a hand, not in greeting, but in a universal gesture for everyone to wait. The two boats glide within shouting distance. The paddlers, 5 in total, pause. One stands slowly, balancing with unnatural grace. He holds up a hand in return, not a wave, but something like a sign, not aggressive, not exactly welcoming, just a signal. I see you. Here's your historical fact. The Norse encountered indigenous peoples in Greenland and later in North America. These first contacts were tense and often ended poorly. The sagas describe trade, conflict, and attempts at communication, but also sudden violence. The Norse were intruders in a land already known and inhabited, and while they had superior weapons, the locals had something the Norse could never match, an understanding of the land, the ice, the animals, and how to thrive in a world that would eat outsiders alive. The two sides watch each other for a while. Then the paddler lowers his hand, gestures to the shore, and the boats turn, moving toward a shallow cove not far from where your longship is anchored. The decision is unspoken. Eric nods once, then gestures for the crew to follow on foot, up the rocky ridge and down the other side. You crest the hill and see the Skraeling camp. Small, low structures, half buried in the snow, built from stones, hides and driftwood. There's no smoke, no open fires, just small lamps glowing inside the shelters, their flickering light barely visible through stretched sealskin walls. You wonder how they stay warm in there. Then it clicks. The boats, the shelters, the silence. These people have mastered the art of surviving without fire as you know it. They don't build big flames. They don't waste wood. They don't light up the night like a beacon for every hungry animal to see. They burn blubber. They insulate with snow. They wear the warmth of the animals they eat. Their lives are a kind of quiet, invisible magic. Quirky fact, traditional Inuit and other Arctic peoples used ingenious forms of insulation, like igloos, made from compressed snow, which actually trap body heat so efficiently that inside temperatures can hover around 0 degrees, even when it's of 40 degrees outside. They use soapstone lamps fueled by seal or whale oil to light and heat their homes, often with no chimney. The Norse, with their wood and stone architecture and their roaring fires, must have looked wasteful, noisy and ridiculous by comparison. There's an awkward exchange between the two groups. You bring gifts, beads, bits of iron, a small blade. They offer hides, dried meat, carved bone tools. No common language, just gestures and grunts and eye contact that speaks of mutual suspicion and reluctant curiosity. One of the locals, older, face lined like weathered stone, comes forward, holding something wrapped in fur. It's a lamp, a real one, soapstone carved shallow and precise, with a loop of twisted moss sticking out of thick oil. He holds it out toward Eric like it's an invitation or a challenge. Eric takes it, carefully. The old man lights the lamp with a flint spark. The moss catches. The flame is small but steady. It doesn't roar. It purrs. The scent of seal fat fills the air. Thick, greasy, strangely comforting. The warmth is immediate, localized and efficient. No smoke, no flare, just clean, quiet fire like a whisper. Eric looks stunned. The rest of the crew leans in, eyes wide, as if they're watching something sacred. And in a way they are, because this isn't just a lamp, it's a lesson. There's a scholarly debate still raging in some circles about the extent and depth of Norse indigenous interaction in North America. Some argue it was brief and violent, lasting no more than a few years. Others point to artifacts, oral traditions and genetic evidence that suggest longer contact. Maybe even integration in isolated cases. But one thing's certain, the locals had answers the Norse desperately needed, especially when it came to surviving without the luxuries they thought were essential. That night, back at camp, the soapstone lamp sits in the centre of your group. Everyone watches it, no one says much. The flame is low, steady and shockingly warm. Someone dips a strip of dried fish into the bowl, warms it, and passes it around. It tastes better than any campfire meal you've had in weeks. You watch the shadows dance on the rocks and realise the Norse idea of fire was just one version of a much older story. The Skraelings, who didn't write sagas, didn't carve runestones, didn't name every fjord and rock, had their own legacy, burning in bowls of blubber and built into boats made of bones and skins. You fall asleep with the lamp flickering beside you, the scent of seal oil thick in your nose. You dream of skin boats slicing through ice, of silent paddlers moving like shadows, of homes made from snow and warmth that doesn't need to shout to be felt. And when you wake, the lamp is still burning. You leave the Skraeling camp with full stomachs and a little more humility than you had 2 days ago. No one says it loud, but the lesson is still smouldering in your minds like the lamp that burned quietly through the night. They survived this land without fire the way you understand it, and not just for a few weeks, for generations, without longships, without iron, without wooden halls or sagas or prayers to loud, angry gods. They had skin boats, blubber lamps, bone tools, and knowledge that turned snow into shelter and wind into warning. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. But you have to move on. The coast keeps calling. And Eric, he's restless again. You can see it in the way he packs up in silence, tying knots faster than necessary, already calculating the route ahead. Vinland's close, he mutters. We'll find it soon. So you head south again, hugging the coast, with the land rising to your right, still jagged and harsh in places, but slowly softening. The air carries a hint of earth now, not just salt and snow. You spot birds you haven't seen in weeks, long-winged, low-flying things that skim the sea looking for fish, their cries more musical than the harsh gulls of the northern islands. There are trees again too, not just scrub or twisted pine, but real trees with limbs reaching toward the sky, like they're welcoming you to a new chapter. But the question looms heavier now than it did before. What happens when there are no more trees to cut down? Because even here, where the forest creeps down toward the coast, the Vikings face a terrible truth they can't escape. The farther they sail west, the less firewood they can carry. You're already stretched thin. The bundles from Markland are nearly gone. The ship's ribs are dry, the kindling pouch is almost empty. This, and every crew member is doing that thing where they glance at driftwood like it's meat. Here's your historical fact. Wood was a critical resource for the Norse settlers, and in Greenland, the scarcity of native trees became a defining obstacle. While dwarf willows and birch existed, they were too small for construction or consistent fuel. Most firewood had to be driftwood, carried in by ocean currents, or imported from Norway and Iceland. As the Vikings pushed further west toward Vinland, they hoped, desperately for a land rich in forests. The sagas even emphasise this, not because they loved timber aesthetically, but because it meant heat. The irony is bitter. You have axes, you have the skill to split logs, you even have the calloused hands for it. But now, more often than not, you stand beside a beautiful tree and stare at it, wondering if you dare cut it down, because if you do, there might not be another for miles. Fire is no longer just a comfort, it's a risk calculation. Some of the crew start rationing their fire use even more. Boots are dried just long enough to stop freezing. Meals are warmed but not cooked. Lamps are lit only when absolutely necessary. The fire is shrinking not in flame but in meaning, becoming a resource like iron or gold, not a thing you build nightly without thought. Quirky fact, in some extreme cases, Viking expeditions would burn their own ships, literally chop them up for firewood, if they knew they were settling in a place with no forests. It wasn't common because it meant you weren't going back, but it happened. There's even a saga where a crew does exactly that, turning their boat into fire and then building a longhouse from the bones. Talk about commitment. Eric says they did it once, years ago, Greenland coast. They'd misjudged the distance between fuel sources. Burn the oars first, he says, grinning like it's a joke. Then the bencher, then the mast. He pats the current longship's hull like it's a dog that survived a war. This one stays intact. But still, the tension is there. The next night you camp near a thicket of small trees. Spindly birch and alder, barely thick enough to call logs. You use fallen branches. No one chops anything that's still alive. That's the new rule now. Use only what the land gives freely, because the land might stop giving soon. The fire you build is small, controlled. You crouch around it with the others, arms tucked in, letting your breath fog in the cold night air while flames whisper against a backdrop of rustling branches. The warmth doesn't reach your back, but it's enough to keep your fingers moving. You warm the seal fat, chew cold meat, rub your hands together between bites. There's a scholarly debate about how firewood shortages contributed to the failure of Norse settlements in North America. Some argue it was one of the major causes. Without consistent fuel, cooking, metalwork, and even basic sanitation became difficult. Others believe it was one piece of a larger puzzle, weather shifts, isolation, and conflicts with locals. But either way, the wood didn't last. And without wood, everything else starts to crumble. You feel it now, the slow unravelling. The quiet understanding that you're sailing into a world that wasn't built for fire the way your home was. You've adapted, sure, you've eaten raw, you've slept in frost, you've learned to love a blubber lamp more than a roaring hearth. But it's a fragile balance, and fire is still your tether to the world you left behind. That night, someone suggests burning part of a broken oar to keep the fire going longer. Eric shuts it down immediately. We burn that, we stop being sailors, he says, and that's that. The oar gets tucked under the boat like a sacred relic. You go to sleep colder than usual, curled against the hull, your cloak stiff from sea spray. No one says it, but everyone's wondering how much fire is left in the world ahead, because trees don't grow fast, and even if Vinland is real, even if it's covered in forests, even if it's everything the sagas hinted at, you still have to get there, and you have to get there without burning the boat that brought you this far. It happens on the 6th morning after leaving the Skraeling camp. You're sitting on the ship's rail, fingers numb despite your best efforts, watching the sun try to climb over a horizon full of mist. Everyone's quiet. Even the ocean is calmer today, like it's holding its breath. Then someone shouts. Not a panic shout, just one of those primal guttural calls that says, "Come look at this right now." You snap your head around, already standing before your brain tells your legs to move. Eric's pointing west, toward the coast. You squint, trying to make sense of what you're seeing. Green. Not patches of moss clinging to rocks, not scrub pine clinging to cliffs, but actual green. Trees, yes, but more than that. Fields, rolling land. The shoreline dips gently toward a forested interior that seems impossibly lush after weeks of grey stone and frostbitten ridges. There are birds you've never heard before, singing something that almost sounds like laughter. A breeze hits your face warm enough to not sting, and then, As the ship glides into a shallow bay, you smell it. Dirt. Not wet, cold mud, real earth. Warm soil full of roots and leaves and things growing. For the first time in weeks, your senses register life instead of survival. Vinland. Or so Eric says. He doesn't yell it like a triumph. He just whispers it once under his breath, then repeats it again, louder. Vinland. The crew picks it up, passing it around in murmurs, tasting the word like it's the first fresh thing that they have had in ages. Here's your historical fact. According to the Icelandic sagas, Vinland was the southernmost point reached by Norse explorers in North America, believed by most scholars to be somewhere around modern-day Newfoundland. The name Vinland is often translated as Land of Wine or Land of Vines, based on accounts that wild grapes grew there in abundance. Whether or not that's true is still debated, but one thing is clear. The Norse believed this place was rich, warm and full of promise. As the longship scrapes up onto the shore, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Softness. The sand is real. It sinks under your boots instead of cracking beneath them. The trees stretch tall and straight, their bark dry, their leaves are still clinging despite the season. You want to kiss one? You actually consider it. Instead, you slap a trunk and mutter, "You'll burn well," which feels close enough. The crew fans out, exploring the edge of the woods, sniffing the air like wolves. Brynjar finds a cluster of berries and eats them without hesitation. Someone else finds a stream so clear it reflects the sky perfectly. You kneel beside it, cupping water into your mouth and nearly weep. It's sweet, cold, clean. Not seawater, not glacial runoff, just water. Eric's orders are simple. Build camp. A real one this time. Not a hasty fire pit on a wet patch of stone. Not a shipboard nap in a soggy cloak. A proper, honest camp with walls, a roof and more than one fire. The crew moves like they've been waiting their whole lives for this. Axes come out. Not for desperation, for construction. The sound of blades hitting wood echoes through the trees like a hymn. Logs are felled, branches stripped. No one says a word about saving the trees. This is what they came for. Not conquest, not gold, just this, fuel. They build the first fire that night with dry, living wood, split from fresh-cut logs and stacked in a proper pit. When it catches, there's a pause. Everyone watches the flames like they've never seen them before. The smell is new, rich, resinous pine and sweet smoke rising into the sky. It curls into your nostrils, into your memory. It smells like home, not the one you left, but the one you might build now. Quirky fact, even though the name Vinland is often associated with grapes, some historians suggest the Norse were simply unfamiliar with the local berries and mistook them for grapevines. Others argue the term could have referred more generally to fertile land. Still others suggest it was a branding effort. Make the place sound more appealing for future settlers. Whether or not there were actual grapes, the idea of a land rich in resources became part of the legend. You roast meat over the fire for the first time in weeks, actual roasting, not half-thawed chunks of fish or lukewarm blubber jerky, but meat browned over flame, spitting and crackling as the juices hiss into the coals. You eat with your fingers, grease running down your wrists, and you don't care. No one does. There's laughter again. Full-bellied, unguarded, human laughter. Later, Eric draws a rough map in the dirt with a stick, marking the bay, the nearby stream, the tree line. It's not art, it's intent. The implication is clear, this place could be something. A camp, a post, or maybe even a settlement. But not everyone's convinced. There's a quiet discussion that night around the fire. Some say the land feels too soft, too perfect, that the locals will return and it'll go badly, that the weather will turn and the land will reveal its teeth. No one says it loud, but everyone's thinking the same thing. Why hasn't anyone else settled here already? There's a scholarly debate about whether the Norse ever attempted a permanent settlement in Vinland. The Lansol Meadow site in Newfoundland shows clear signs of Norse habitation, but only briefly, perhaps a decade, maybe less. Some believe they planned a colony, but abandoned it after conflict with the indigenous population. Others think it was always meant to be temporary. A waypoint, a story to tell, a legend to grow. You lie back on a bed of pine needles that night, cloak open, belly full, fire crackling a few feet away. Above you, the stars are clearer than they've ever been. The wind is gentle. The trees sway in slow rhythm. You're warm. And for the first time in this whole journey, you don't have to fight to be warm. You fall asleep with the scent of smoke in your hair. dreams full of vineyards and forests and fires that never go out. In the morning there will be work, there always is, but tonight you rest like someone who's finally found what they've been searching for, even if just for a little while. Vinland. By the third day in Vinland, it starts to feel suspiciously like success. The camp is shaping up, logs stacked into walls, fire pits ringed with stones, lean-tos with roofs that don't leak every time the wind so much as hiccups. The men move differently now too, shoulders less hunched. Eyes not darting to the horizon every 5 minutes like they were expecting the gods to snatch it all away. Even Eric, who's built entirely out of caution and old rope, lets himself laugh when a squirrel drops a pine cone on Arne's head. It's a warm golden thing, the laugh, not the pine cone. You're falling into the routine again, but this time the routine is softer. There's wood to burn and food to eat, deer, rabbits, fish all teeming in this strange, gentle land. Your fire isn't a desperate flicker anymore. It's central. A steady, crackling presence that never needs to be coaxed into existence with seal fat and prayers. You start to forget what it was like to eat cold meat in the rain or chew bark for warmth. But just as the edges of hardship begin to blur, something shifts. It happens during a trade attempt. You're on the beach again, watching the water when 3 small skin boats appear from the southern Jibenis of the bay. They're familiar now, silent, narrow, fast, skrailing boats. But these are different men. You can tell before they even land, the way they move, the way they sit higher in their boats, weapons more visible, no welcoming hand gestures this time, just straight stares and unreadable faces. Eric walks down the shore with a gift bundle. Iron nails, a woven belt, a bright red comb. He places it in the sand and backs up slowly. The lead skrailing approaches, takes the bundle, examines each item without expression, then looks up. He doesn't smile. And then, just as quickly, they paddle away. Nothing said. Gesture of trade, no eye contact on departure. That night, Eric doesn't sleep. He sits by the fire, sharpening a blade he hasn't touched since Greenland. When Brynjar asks what he's thinking, Eric just says, "They're not the same ones." Here's your historical fact. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, early Norse settlers in Vinland had limited but significant interactions with the native populations. Some encounters were peaceful, involving trade and cautious curiosity. Others turned violent. One account tells of a bull escaping from the Norse camp and startling a skrailing group, causing panic and a retaliatory attack that drove the Norse settlers away. Whether this story is literal or embellished, it illustrates a tension that was always lurking. The next few days pass under a kind of invisible fog. Not weather, but tension. Everyone watches the tree line more than they used to. Firewood is gathered in pairs now. No one goes to the stream alone. You light more fires, not just for warmth, but for visibility, for reassurance, for warnings. And then it happens. One morning you wake to find the meat rack knocked over, dried fish scattered across the ground, and the hide roof of the cook shelter slashed with something sharp. Nothing was stolen, no one was harmed, but it's a message, an invitation to leave. Eric takes it seriously, so does everyone else. That afternoon you see the boats again. 4 this time, more men, standing this time, watching. No weapons drawn, but no need. The message is clear, this land is already spoken for. Quirky fact, some Norse settlements carried portable iron cauldrons and tools specifically for trade, knowing that metal was valuable to the indigenous people of the Americas. But iron also marked them as outsiders, bringing foreign tools, foreign gods, foreign fire. To some groups that might have been interesting, to others threatening. You hold a long meeting that night, seated in a ring around the fire like it's the last piece of order holding the world together. The discussion isn't loud, it doesn't need to be. Everyone already knows where it's headed. "We're not staying," Eric says eventually. "Not now." There's a long silence. Not defeat, just cold calculation. You've done the math, you've seen the signs. This land might be beautiful, fertile, warm, but it's not yours, and forcing the issue would mean blood. Here's the scholarly debate. Why did the Norse leave Vinland? The land was rich, the resources plentiful, and they clearly had the skills to survive there. Some say that it was the distance from Greenland and Iceland, too far to resupply, too vulnerable to isolation. Others believe the true reason was social. They were never alone. The Skraelings didn't attack out of nowhere. They defended. And the Norse, for all their boats and blades, didn't come with armies, just settlers. You start packing the next morning. The fires are allowed to burn low. Gear is loaded. The ship, which had started to feel more like a skeleton these past few weeks, is suddenly alive again. The dragonhead is mounted, the oars tested, the timbers creak like they remember what they were made for. But before you leave, there's one last thing. Eric orders a cairn built at the edge of the bay. A mound of stones, waist-high, simple. On top he places a carved plank from the longhouse you never finished, inscribed with a name that no one reads aloud. Then he steps back, and for the first time since Iceland, you see him hesitate. He lights one last fire beside it. Not for cooking, not for light, just memory. It's small, smoky, fed with the last of the good wood. No one gathers around it. You just watch from a distance as the flame flickers, holds, and finally dies into ash. You push off at dawn. No songs, no cheers, just the rhythmic splash of oars and the quiet sob of sand as the longship glides back into the sea. Vinland fades behind you like a fever dream, green, lush, and unreachable. And the fire in your memory burns brighter than the one you left behind. The fire in the hearth is gone, but the smell lingers. Soot, pine pitch, and something faintly sweet from the last bits of sap that clung to the logs. You left it behind in Vinland, that modest ring of blackened stones and memories. Now, as the longship pushes east again, cutting through calmer water than you deserve, all that's left are echoes, of warmth, of wood smoke, of what could have been. You've been sailing for 3 days now, wind steady, seas mercifully low. But as the shore of Greenland crawls back into view, hard, cold, unwelcoming, you feel the difference settle into your bones. You're not returning to a home, you're returning to a challenge. Greenland doesn't want you here. It never did. When you beach the ship near one of the old winter camps, one of the half-built longhouses with a collapsed sod roof and moss creeping up the corners, the first thing you notice is the silence. The second is the cold. Not just air cold, stone cold. The kind of chill that lives inside things, that gets into your tools, your skin, your bones, and your intentions. You and the others drag the boat up just enough to escape the tides, then begin the slow process of reclaiming shelter from a ruin. And then you face the question no one wants to ask. How do you warm a longhouse without setting the whole thing on fire? It's not as simple as just lighting a flame and hoping for the best. Viking longhouses were built with turf and timber, packed earth floors, and central hearths that had to be carefully managed. In places like Greenland, where the wood is scarce and often damp, and the walls are made of flammable sod and birch bark, fire is less a convenience and more a balancing act. One mistake and the warmth you crave becomes the thing that kills you. Here's your historical fact. Norse longhouses in Greenland were often built into the earth for insulation, with thick turf roofs and stone-lined hearths that ran down the centre. They relied on smoke to heat the space indirectly, letting it rise, linger, and slowly warm the walls before venting through small openings or cracks. There were no chimneys in the modern sense. Fires were low, slow-burning, and rarely allowed to blaze. Every ember was managed like it had a vendetta. You gather what fuel you can, driftwood, scrubby deadfall from the ridgeline, dried dung if anyone can stomach collecting it. The fire, when you finally light it inside the longhouse, is barely more than a whisper. A few glowing coals cradled in a bed of moss and stones. You don't build it high, you build it smart, tucked low, controlled by windbreaks of stone and a careful hand. The interior fills with smoke quickly. You cough. Everyone does. But no one opens a flap or punches a hole in the roof. That smoke is the insulation, the slow creep of heat into sod walls that otherwise hold nothing but damp. You sit low to the ground where the air is marginally better. You huddle with the others in the haze, your eyes watering, your throat raw, but your fingertips warm. Quirky fact, the Norse understood how to use smoke to preserve both meat and buildings. In some longhouses, the rafters would blacken and absorb years' worth of soot, creating a kind of natural waterproofing. Some archaeologists believe the smoke helped kill pests and fungi as well, making it a dual-purpose tool. Warmth and sanitation. Of course, it also meant living in what amounted to a smoky pit for half the year. Eric doesn't speak much during those first few days back. He sharpens tools, patches the hull, takes inventory of what's left. You suspect he's calculating not whether you'll survive, but for how long. Greenland is not generous. It never gives without taking twice as much. You'll need to hunt, to gather, to repair relationships with the other Norse families further up the fjord. You'll need luck too, and a miracle or two wouldn't hurt. The longhouse becomes a kind of slow-breathing beast. You learn its rhythms, when to feed the fire, when to let the smoke rise, and where the heat collects. You build sleeping platforms along the walls, raised just enough to avoid the cold floor but low enough to stay in the warm strata of air. You hang meat near the ceiling to dry. You dig channels in the floor to direct melted snow and slush away from your bedding. Survival turned into architecture. Here's the scholarly debate. Did the Norse adapt to the realities of Arctic life, or did they stubbornly try to force their old ways onto a new, unyielding landscape? Some historians argue that they refused to borrow survival strategies from the indigenous peoples, like igloos, fursuits, and portable shelters, choosing instead to stick with familiar longhouses and European farming methods that failed in the cold. Others believe the Norse did adapt, just not fast enough or in great enough numbers to create lasting change. You think about this as you lay near the hearth, watching the coals pulse like the heart of some buried giant. Your cloak smells like smoke now. Your hair does too. You've stopped noticing. Everyone's hair does. It's not comfort, what you've built here. It's not even really shelter, not in the way the word feels back home. It's closer to a pact, a deal struck with the land. I will feed you fire if you promise not to kill me in my sleep. You never let it go out. Not completely. Even when everyone else is asleep, one man stays awake, watching it, turning it, whispering to it like it's alive. Because in Greenland, fire isn't a tool, it's the only thing that remembers what life used to feel like. By now, the fire and you are one and the same. You rise when it rises, dim when it dims. It breathes through the longhouse as surely as you do, every ember feeding your warmth, every curl of smoke keeping frost from worming into your lungs. You can't remember the last time you weren't thinking about fuel, where to find it, how to carry it, how long it might burn. You dream about firewood. You wake up cataloguing what's left. You count sticks like coins. It's midwinter in Greenland now, the worst part of the year. The kind of cold that's no longer just outside your shelter. It's in your boots, your joints, your breath. Every creak in the timber sounds like bones. The sea is frozen beyond the fjord. The animals have vanished or burrowed deep. Even the wind has gone quiet, like the world's holding its breath just long enough to see who makes it out alive. And the fire, it's shrinking. You've burned through everything easy. Driftwood from the beaches, old crates, even the handles of broken tools. There was a moment last week when Brynjar seriously suggested burning the old sail frame. Eric nearly snapped his neck. "Burn the sail, we might as well eat the rudder," he said, and no one laughed. Now you're into the rationed bundles. The last of the timber from Vinland, hardwood, dry, perfect for heat but too precious to use all at once. You split it carefully. With an axe so dull you may as well be hitting it with a spoon. You count every spark. Here's your historical fact. Archaeological digs in Greenland have uncovered longhouses where charred bones outnumber wood ash by a staggering margin. In times of desperation, the Norse burned bones, seal, caribou, even cattle, as fuel. It doesn't burn clean, it doesn't burn well, but it burns hot enough, and that's all that matters. The bones go in, blacken, crack and hiss. If it smokes enough to sting your eyes, it's working. You burn bones now too. They pop and split in the fire like angry voices, sending up little clouds of white ash that drift through the longhouse and settle on your bedding. You get used to the smell, like scorched meat and ancient dust. The heat is inconsistent. One moment it's too hot to sit near, the next it's just smoke and disappointment. You make it work. The longhouse feels smaller with each passing day, not because it's literally shrinking, but because you are. You and the others have curled inward, physically and emotionally. Meals are simple. Broth, dried meat, seaweed if you're lucky. You eat next to the fire, sleep next to the fire, relieve yourself away from the fire, and then hurry back like it's a jealous god that might forget you if you're gone too long. Quirky fact. Vikings in Greenland sometimes use dried seaweed not just for food, but for fuel. The right kind, dried and tightly packed, could smoulder long enough to keep a small fire alive. But it stank like wet dog and old fish, and anyone who smelled of it too strongly earned a nickname. There's a rune stone that roughly translates to Torstein the Smoke Armpit. You can guess why. You haven't reached that level of desperation yet, but you're close. One night the fire goes out. It's no one's fault. The bone pile was too damp. The wind turned through the roof crevice. The embers died quietly in their stone bed, while everyone slept too hard from too little food. You wake to the cold like a slap in the teeth. the kind that makes your eyelashes freeze together. The longhouse is silent, not peaceful, dead. Someone curses, someone else starts coughing, the dry kind that makes you wonder if you'll stop. Eric doesn't shout, he just gets up and starts shaving wood from a handle he swore he'd save for repairs. You strike flint like your life depends on it, because it does. After the third attempt, the moss catches, the flame flickers, and everyone leans in, hands out like worshippers at a shrine. And there's the debate again, whispered around the fire, in the still hours when your fingers are too numb to carve, too tired to repair. Why didn't the Norse adapt more? Why didn't they take more from the Skraelings, their lamps, their winter shelters, their mobility? Some say pride, others say habit. A few believe they just couldn't imagine a life where fire wasn't at the centre of everything. They built societies around hearths. Hall fires weren't just warmth. They were politics, identity, story. The Norse didn't just burn wood, they belonged to it. You think about that as you feed the last of the bone pile into the coals and watch the flame catch and stretch. What do you belong to now? The land? It doesn't want you, the fire. It's trying to leave you. And yet you stay. You take to wearing your boots to sleep now, just in case you need to run out and gather more dung, or chip frozen fat off a carcass, or drag in more driftwood if the sea ever gives any back. Your cloak never comes off. Neither does your belt. You've become a creature of layers, smoke, and readiness. If the fire goes again, you need to move fast. The others are the same. Gaunt, sharp-eyed, smoky shadows of the men who once joked about feasts and farmsteads. No one complains, no one has the energy, but everyone looks at the fire like it's the last living thing in the house. And maybe it is. You lose count of the days somewhere after the last full moon, when the night sky turned cloudy and stayed that way. Time becomes firelight and hunger, two recurring beats that measure the rhythm of your life. If there's flame, it's morning. If it's just embers, it's night. If you're lucky enough to feel your toes while standing, it must be a warm day. And then something happens that breaks the cycle. The smoke doesn't rise. You notice it first when you stir from sleep and realise the air isn't choking you. It's just cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that wraps around your spine before you even open your eyes. The hearth is dead again, but not like last time when the embers wheezed out during sleep. This time, someone put it out. At first, you think it's an accident. Then you see the snow inside the longhouse. The storm hit while you slept. Blinding, white, sideways wind, the kind that sneaks in under the door and through the roof cracks and doesn't leave politely. The drift is knee-high in the main room, pressed against the wall, curling in like a petulant guest who was told to stay outside. Someone swears, someone else sneezes and doesn't stop. You all look at each other like you're waiting for someone to call it a joke, but no one does. Outside it's worse, the air moves like it's made of knives. The fjord is white and howling, visibility reduced to the nearest bent tree and your own teeth. The door flap won't close properly. Ice has hardened along the seams. And the fire is gone. Not just extinguished, vanished. The flint's still here, the moss too, but everything's damp. Every precious bundle of kindling is crusted with snow or soaked with sleet. The bowl of seal fat is frozen solid, the wick buried beneath a layer of translucent ice. You try to spark the flint, but it's like trying to light a wet rag. The cold eats sparks like it's starving. Eric's face says what no one wants to admit. You might not get it back this time. Here's your historical fact. In the harshest months, Norse settlers in Greenland often faced fireless stretches, periods where they couldn't cook, couldn't dry clothing, couldn't even stay awake long enough to keep embers alive. Without reliable fuel, they'd huddle in insulated sleeping platforms, enclosed box-like bunks built into the longhouse walls, sharing body heat and waiting out the worst of the season. Meals would go uncooked. Tools would freeze to hands. Death wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet and forgettable. The crew collapses into motion. Brynjar tries to dig through the drift inside the house looking for anything dry. Arna slices open the last bale of moss and tries to wring it out. You go outside because someone has to, because driftwood might have piled up during the night. And if any of it's dry beneath the top layer of snow, you might have a chance. You stumble toward the shoreline, wind ripping through your cloak like it's made of lace. Your boots crunch through snow that isn't fluffy. It's dense and wet and eager to swallow you. The sea beyond the ice edge is boiling with mist, waves crashing against frozen stones like fists pounding on a locked door. And there it is. A log, half buried, wedged between two rocks. Maybe oak, maybe birch, You can't tell, you dig with your hands, frozen fingers chipping away at the ice, tugging and straining, until the wood gives and comes free with a crack. It's soaked, you scream, not words, just frustration. The wind takes the sound and throws it back in your face, but you drag it back anyway. You haul the log through snow and wind and silence back into the longhouse where the others sit in near dark, hands buried under cloaks, eyes glazed over with resignation. The door flap slaps open behind you, and they look up, not in hope, just curiosity. You toss the log on the floor. Brynjar lifts it, sniffs it. He shakes his head, too wet. But then Eric steps forward with something wrapped in oilskin, his last secret. A tiny bundle of pine shavings wrapped so tightly in nibs of wax cloth that not a drop of moisture has touched it. He sets it in a hollow stone bowl, sprinkles dried moss around it, and begins to strike flint. You hold your breath. Once, twice, then spark. The moss twitches, the shavings curl, the flame licks upward. Tiny, uncertain, like a child waking up in the dark. And then, miracle, the fire lives. It's small, it's terrified, but it lives. Here's your quirky fact. The Norse carried fire seeds across Upod's oceans. Small bundles of slow-burning material, often kept wrapped in animal fat and bark, designed to smoulder for hours without open flame. Some used fungus, like amadou, known to catch and hold a coal long enough to transfer from one fire to another. It wasn't foolproof, but it gave them a fighting chance. You feed the newborn flame with splinters shaved from the inside of the wet log. Then you hover over it like a priest, hands outstretched, breath held. Everyone gathers, silent, forming a wall against the wind. The log won't catch yet, but it's steaming now, not frozen. The moss blackens and curls, spitting smoke that clings to the rafters and stings your eyes like victory. Later, after the worst has passed and the fire is a real one again, you all sit in a ring like always, closer than ever, knees touching, cloaks overlapping. The longhouse is still freezing, the wind is still moaning. But that flicker in the centre? That's defiance. There's a scholarly debate about how often fire truly failed Norse settlers. The sagas don't dwell on it, but archaeology tells the quieter story. Hearths rebuilt over and over, fire pits dug and moved, soot layers stacked like rings on a tree. It wasn't just fire, it was the will to light it again and again, even when everything said don't bother. You fall asleep with your feet almost warm, not hot, not dry, just almost. And for tonight, that's enough. By the time the ice begins to loosen its grip, your face has changed. So has everyone else's. The cold has carved your features like wind against stone, lips split, cheeks hollow, eyes deeper in their sockets. There's a kind of frostbite that never shows up in the fingers or toes, but settles in the soul instead. And you're starting to understand that particular ache. You survived the winter, sure, but not unscathed. The fire is still going, though. It's small now, stubborn and smoky, but it's alive. And so are you. That's more than most can say. It's early spring now, or at least Greenland's version of spring. You wake one morning to find the snow melted just enough to reveal patches of black soil and stone. A trickle of water flows down from the ridgeline. The wind smells less like death and more like salt and lichen. And for the first time in weeks, you hear a bird. Not a desperate gull or a crow picking through trash, but a real bird. Song and everything. The fire that morning is different too. You're feeding it with real wood again. Not driftwood, not dung, not frozen splinters soaked in seal oil. It took 3 men to climb the nearest slope, find a fallen tree from last summer, and drag it back. You split it carefully. The wood sings when it cracks. When you lay it into the coals, the flame grows tall enough to stretch shadows across the whole longhouse. It's almost ceremonial. Eric stands in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the fire like he's reading it. You've seen him do this before, treating flames like omens, like they're telling him what to do next. After a long moment, he says, "We're going back to the sea." No one objects. Here's your historical fact. The Norse in Greenland didn't just farm and hunt. They fished, heavily. Cod, halibut, seal and walrus became lifelines, not just for meat but for trade. Walrus ivory, in particular, was shipped back to Europe, where it was carved into religious art and chess pieces. But fishing wasn't just economic, it was also tactical. Out on the coast, the ice melted sooner. Driftwood washed up there, the sun reached it better. You could light fires and cook without choking on smoke in a turf box. So back to the coast you go. It's a half-day hike with sleds and rope, the snow still stubborn in the shaded places. You pack up what you can, a few bundles of dry wood, 2 fat seal bladders filled with oil, your dullest axe, and a sack of frozen fish you're pretending isn't already half rotten. You leave the longhouse behind without ceremony. There's no reason to mourn it. It did its job. Barely. Down at the water, the air feels different. Brighter, maybe, or just more awake. The sea ice is breaking in great slabs, and between the cracks, you see the grey-green glimmer of open water. The wind is still sharp, but it doesn't carry pain anymore. Just warning. You build the fire first. You don't even set up camp before you do. The driftwood is damp, but not hopeless, and the sun helps. You dig a pit just above the tide line, ring it with stones, and lay the fire carefully. Shavings, bark, splinters, the thinnest sticks you've got. You use the same flint from Vinland. It's chipped now, edges worn smooth, but it sparks. The first curl of smoke is met with a kind of reverence. Everyone crowds in close. It's a habit now. Fire makes you gather. The same way blood draws predators. You all know the drill. Feed it. Shield it. Don't speak too loud in case it's listening. Quirky fact. In some coastal Viking camps, hearths were reused year after year, their stones blackened and worn smooth. Some archaeologists have found layers of ash and charred bones stacked like pages in a book, each one a chapter of survival. Sometimes they find bits of personal items, a bead, a broken knife tip, buried in the ash. Accidental offerings, or maybe just things forgotten in the dark. You eat warm food for the first time in days. Not just hot food, but fresh. You caught the fish an hour ago, and now it hisses on a flat stone by the fire, bubbling with fat. It sisks, crisping in the flame. It tastes like forgiveness. And something strange happens that night. You don't sleep in shifts. You build a windbreak from washed up boards and branches. You roll out your cloak. You keep the fire close, but you're not afraid anymore. Not of it going out, not of someone freezing in the night. For the first time in months, no one says, "Who's on the fire next?" You just let it burn. The wood is dry, the wind is mild, you let it burn all night, and you sleep like someone who believes tomorrow might actually arrive. There's a scholarly debate about whether the Norse ever understood what the land was trying to tell them. Some scholars think they were always on the verge of adapting fully, that if Greenland had held on a little longer, they might have made it. Others argue they clung too hard to their old ways, to firewood, to architecture, to farming in soil that barely qualified as dirt. But nights like this, when the fire burns clean and steady, when the sea gives you just enough fish to feel full, you understand why they stayed as long as they did. In the morning, the fire's still there. A small bed of glowing coals nestled in the ash, still warm enough to reignite. You stoke it gently, feed it a few slivers of bark, and watch it wake up with a soft exhale of smoke. You don't have to build it anymore. You just tend it. Like it's part of you now. You make tea from moss and old pine needles. You dry your socks over the flame. You warm your hands without urgency. And you realise something you didn't expect. You're not afraid of the cold anymore. You respect it, sure. You know its teeth. But it doesn't own you now. The fire taught you that. You don't expect to see another ship. Not after everything. The frostbitten months. The failed dream of Vinland. The endless burning of things never meant to be firewood. But there it is one morning on the horizon, just where the sea yawns open between the broken ice floes, and the sky forgets how to colour anything but grey. A black dot, then a shape, then a sail, square cut, furled tight against the wind, unmistakably Norse. It cuts across the fjord like a memory you thought you buried, leaving a trail of oar foam and questions in its wake. You and the others stand from your fire pit, smoke still curling around your boots, and you watch the ship approach like ghosts welcoming one of their own. It doesn't make land immediately. It circles once, slow and cautious, then beaches near the same rock where you first landed last year. You know that curve in the shore like a birthmark now. You could find it in your sleep. The men disembark, 7 of them, lean and wrapped in grey wool, their cloaks stiff with sea crust. Strangers, but not unknowns. You can tell from the way they move that they're Greenlanders too. Their faces have that same chiselled look, that winter-hardened tightness around the mouth that comes from months spent talking only when absolutely necessary. They wear survival the same way you do, like armour too valuable to take off. Eric is already walking toward them, hand raised in peace. You trail behind with the rest of the crew. The smell of their ship hits you first, salt, fish oil, and something acidic like fermented seaweed. You recognise the scent. It means desperation. Same as always. They've come from a northern settlement, the one at the end of the bay, small, remote, barely a handful of farms. They say the winter was worse there. 2 families gone, the livestock either dead or escaped into the white. One man starved to death in his own longhouse, sitting beside a hearth full of frozen stones and a pile of soaked moss. He couldn't get a fire going, or maybe he just didn't try hard enough. You all exchange stories around the fire that night. Your visitors sit close, greedily soaking in the warmth, their hands out like they're trying to absorb it through the skin. You pass around boiled fish, seal broth, and the last hunk of bark bread someone had the foresight to hoard. It's awful. They eat it like kings. Here's your historical fact. By the 14th and 15th centuries too, the Norse settlements in Greenland were declining rapidly. The western settlement disappeared first, with signs that it had been completely abandoned by the mid-1300s. The eastern settlement, actually more southwest, held on longer but eventually faded too. Archaeologists still argue about the exact causes: climate cooling, soil exhaustion, isolation from trade, or increased conflict with the Thule Inuit, who were thriving while the Norse faded. The men from the north bring news from Iceland too. Traders passed through before the sea froze. The mainland is still struggling, but warmer. There's talk of pulling back, of abandoning Greenland entirely, of sailing home, even if home now barely remembers your name. Someone asks Eric what he thinks. Should they stay, rebuild, or go back? He doesn't answer immediately. He just stares into the fire, a long silence stretching like fresh skin over an old wound. Finally, he says, "Fire kept us alive, but it won't build a future. Not here." There's a strange comfort in that, even if it feels like surrender. Quirky fact: there are ruins in Greenland, stone foundations, broken walls, collapsed churches, where the last fires went out and were never relit. One in particular, called Garda, was once a bishop's seat. Its hearth is still black with soot, but no one has used it in centuries. You can visit it now and stand where a man once prayed for warmth he couldn't summon. You go down to the shore the next morning and look at the ship again. It's smaller than yours, but seaworthy. The sail has been patched a dozen times and the oars are mismatched, some carved from bone, others from driftwood. It looks exactly like what you've become, stitched together from loss and made to float anyway. You speak with the others, not in dramatic speeches, just nods, a few whispered agreements. The fire's been kind, but you all feel it. This place is no longer a stop, it's a wait, so you begin to pack, not everything. You leave behind the stone hearth, the bones, the soot-streaked walls of the camp you built when you still thought Vinland would fix everything. But you carry what matters: tools, oil, the fireseed bundle Eric's kept tucked in fur all this time, and memory. Here's the scholarly debate. Did the last Norse settlers know they were the last? Did they leave consciously, or did they fade one by one without ever saying goodbye? Some believe they merged with Inuit groups, surviving without sagas. Others think they just slipped beneath the ice of history, unnamed and unmarked. You wonder, standing on the ship again, if anyone will ever know your name. The fire in the camp burns low for the last time as the sail lifts. You don't put it out, you just let it die naturally, wind nibbling at the last curls of flame, smoke drifting upward until it's nothing. No one looks back as you pull away from shore. The sea greets you again, icy, vast, unchanged. But this time you carry fire with you, not just in a pouch or a lamp, but in the way you move, the way you watch the horizon, the way your body understands now what warmth costs and what it's worth. You won't forget. You'll keep the embers dry, you'll watch the sky for ice. And if you're lucky, someday you'll build a new hearth in a place where it's not a miracle to keep it burning. And now here you are, at the end of the voyage, at the edge of the world, with the last embers of the story curling upward into the cold, salt-thick air. You didn't mean to end up here when this began, none of them did. You set out chasing something, land, glory, wood for the fire. But what you found was something smaller, stranger, and harder to explain. Survival without fire, and fire without comfort. That first night back in Scandinavia, assuming you make it home at all, you'll sleep on a bed that doesn't groan when you shift. You'll hang your cloak by the door and not need to thaw it by a smoking pile of bones. You'll hear the crackle of a proper hearth, not the weak purring of oil on moss. And part of you will be thankful. but part of you will miss the quiet discipline of making a fire last one more night with nothing but patience and a splinter of driftwood. See, this wasn't a tale of fire lost. Not really. It was about what happens when you're forced to carry warmth in your memory instead of your hands. It was about the stubborn little things that refuse to die. A spark, a story, a people, and you, standing in the wind, calloused and smoke-etched, with blubber oil under your nails and frost still lodged in your breath. The Vikings didn't master the frozen North Atlantic. They endured it, barely. They stitched together survival from borrowed tricks and bone-fueled flame, kept moving, kept hunting, kept building, even as the sea tried to chew them into pieces. They reached North America without matches, without firewood, and without anything but the kind of reckless, brilliant foolishness that says, maybe we can make it. And somehow they did. For a while. Their fire burned. It smoked, it sputtered, it smoked again, but it burned. And now, in your bed, wherever you are tonight, Reykjavik, Minneapolis, maybe somewhere warmer, you can close your eyes and remember how it felt. To wake with your back against the hull, to chew frozen meat and call it breakfast, to light a lamp with rendered seal fat and whisper a prayer that it would hold. To survive, so pull your blanket a little higher, maybe listen to the hum of your fan, or the faint crackle from a fake fireplace app. Think of how far they sailed, how far you sailed, and the next time your heater clicks on or your campfire flares up on a summer trip, remember, it wasn't always that easy. They did it without fire as you know it, and they made it farther than anyone expected. You probably wouldn't have survived, but now you know what it took, and maybe that's enough. Good night.